Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a newcomer into the temple, a venture into the wonderful world of tabletop, as well as tabletop tubing themselves. Today we have Team WSMF, better known as just Team. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing wonderful, Mildred. Thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you for coming.
It's good to be here.
Thank you for coming on and braving time zone hell. Okay, it wasn't that bad of a time zone jump, but principle.
Yeah, wasn't that bad. Trivial.
Yeah. It's just that when there's been some fairly interesting time zone jumps in this monastery, including some that have an extra 15 minutes. Looking at you, St. John's Island. Yeah, I can't explain that either. There's an hour and 15-minute difference between me and St. John's Island in Canada.
Weird.
Or there's the fact that the central time zone in Australia recently split off into two 30-minute time zones.
They can do that?
Apparently.
Wild.
So I guess even the time zones are trying to kill you down there.
Nothing's not.
But one of the traditions around here is opening with the humble beginnings when it comes to tabletop. You know, the origin story, if you will. Some may even say the villain origin story if you're a GM. But walk me through your first introduction to role-playing games and what made it stick.
Ooh, boy, that's a good question. So, I would want to say it was a good 12, 13 years ago that I started trying to DM. I was first introduced to the world of role-playing through a very niche avenue. Now, I've been a fan of comic books for a very long time, DC, Marvel, all that jazz. Mostly buying old vintage stuff at my local store, but one day I saw on the shelf there was something that caught my eye. The DC Universe role-playing game. Not the older edition, but the one from Green Ronin, based on the Mutants and Masterminds 3rd edition system.
Yeah, the one that was a backdoor introduction to Mutants and Masterminds 3rd edition.
Absolutely. However, in this case, I was the rare one who had never even played D&D before. And getting headlong into Mutants and Masterminds, well, let's say that book sat on my shelf for a while I was reading through it, not knowing anything they were talking about. Because Mutants and Masterminds is a very advanced, shift from the 3.5 kind of OGL. More of a shift from Pathfinder than the full-on 3.5, if I remember right.
Oh.
So, yeah, it's a spin-off of the spin-off of the OGL from 3.5.
Yeah. Mutants and Masterminds was trying to do 3.5's rule set with superheroes. Then there was then it further refined it with the revised edition, and then went a bit further with 3rd edition that was doing its own thing, though there isn't really a Pathfinder association.
Really?
No,
That's my bad.
yeah. Obviously, Pathfinder's Paizo, and it does. And Pathfinder was an offshoot of the 3.5 rule set, but the two of them went in completely different directions. And if I'm being honest, superhero RPGs are a tricky thing to unpack, even for veterans, simply because of the sheer amount of stuff that is done in superhero games. And because of that, you end up with games that put a lot of emphasis on a power system that can do a lot of different things. It's also why the line between superhero games and universal games is very thin. the ultimate case in point with that is the old Champions game, which would evolve into the hero system, and Champions being a setting for it. So
sorry, go
I
ahead.
can see that frustration.
I wouldn't say so much frustration as, I didn't quite have the resources at the time to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
I never quite clicked with Mutants and Masterminds, but that was my first foray into trying to GM, which you can probably tell, total novice, hadn't even gotten into D&D at the time. Didn't go well.
Mm-hmm.
It was mostly homebrew, playing by association, and going with whatever was fun at the time, which I think still informs my GMing style to this day. Even if there's a rule that explicitly says otherwise, I will forego it if the current story would be more fun if it wasn't there.
Yeah, that's pretty much rule 0.
Yeah, I'm very happy to see that become more standardized and explicit in publications. It's always been there, but, trying to run Mutants and Masterminds without understanding it led to a lot of freeform rules of, okay, it says this, oh, we'll do whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was my first game. After that, started getting into 4th edition. Did not get into 4th edition. And that kind of kickstarted my whole involvement with the community as a whole.
Yeah. I've, on this channel, called 4th edition the edition I'm supposed to hate, but the check bounced.
Yeah.
That's not to say I think it's blameless or that I think it's a perfect game, but I do think I think that some of the critiques that it ended up getting are a little less valid than others, especially the MMO complaint, which I might have put more stock in if I didn't hear the exact same angle of complaint with 3rd edition back in 2000.
Yeah. Honestly, at this point, I don't have anything against 4th edition. I haven't even read through it fully in a long while, so I'm not going to complain about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it wasn't a good place for me to try and start off, especially with, as things went on and I started focusing more on the narrative, I got the wrong impression from it, but that was not necessarily the system's fault.
Yeah. I look at that as the fault of a lot of people taking certain takes completely uncritically. Because I do remember someone asking why do you make such a big deal out of what people said about it at the time, and what I had said is that there are, even to this day, there are still people who unironically believe that D&D 4th edition was an attempt to try and bring MMO design into D&D. Even though that's not necessarily true, and 2, I think a lot of the people who advance that argument don't know how MMOs actually work. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I saw that argument being thrown around right around the time Wrath of the Lich King came out, when it came to World of Warcraft. So, peak of WoW's popularity.
Yeah.
It's an interesting coincidence, to say the least.
Yeah. Again, I cannot comment on it in particular, but looking back on it, as I've taken a little bit of a cursory glance back, I don't hate the design philosophy of it. I think that it tried to be a very distinct edition in a lot of different ways, including more of a focus on tactical stuff both in and out of combat. And honestly, I kind of respect it. And seeing a resurgence of 4E inspired systems that are really kicking it off by leaning into that tactical aspect, I quite enjoy it. Like, for example, Lancer, I know has listed 4th edition as a big inspiration, and I think they do the tactical aspect of it very well. But
yeah, there's been Lancer. There's also been Well, I'm kind of cheating by bringing up 13th Age, since one of the designers of that is fourth edition designer Rob Heinsoe, who's been on the show in the past.
Really? Good to know.
Yeah, 13th Age was the brainchild of Heinsoe and Tweet, who were the lead designers of fourth edition and third edition. Um, though I will admit that I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall with some discussions during the third edition era. Like, apparently Skip Williams, who was one of the designers, absolutely hated sorcerers. From what I've heard, which, considering how sorcerers were in 3.0, not 3.5 or Pathfinder, I could see it. They kind of got gimped.
Yeah.
But it is funny that going from those different systems, and the fact that over the years we have had a growing understanding of what fourth edition was trying to do. But there is one thing I will give it credit for, and that is having an answer to one of my biggest complaints with D&D over the years. Not shitting or getting off the pot regarding the setting question. This is not a Some people have tried to say, "Oh, you just have that problem with fifth edition." No, I've had this problem since day one. And I started with the black box. I started with the black books in like the mid '90s of AD&D second edition. There is this issue of wanting elements of that imply a setting, but not putting their foot down in terms of what style of fantasy this is supposed to be. Because you can't just say, oh, it's generic fantasy, because that's still a wide net. Consider the fantasy authors that served as inspiration. Fritz Lieber, Michael Moorcock, obviously Tolkien, and Robert E. Howard. Aside from the fact that they were writing fantasy, they all have nothing in common. Moorcock is most well known for Elric of Melniboné and the Eternal Champion meta series, which in a lot of ways is the anti-Conan, and obviously Conan is Conan, and none of those have anything in common with, say, Lord of the Rings, and some of them barely have anything in common with Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. But you look at most games outside of D&D, and you don't really see that problem.
Yeah, a lot of games tend to have their own setting and stick into it, which, I can definitely see as a problem that I wouldn't say 5e still has necessarily. It's stuck in, but it's hard if you don't have a definitive setting that you can base the rules in,
And sometimes just the aspects of the setting. I did a whole video not too long ago talking about my problems with the Vancian model, which is one of those long-standing issues I've had. And one big aspect of it is because... Oh. And thank you, Gizmo, for joining the monastery. Hope you enjoy your time here. But consider that whole spells per day model, known as the Vancian model, because it's heavily inspired by the works of Jack Vance.
Yep. The classics. Sorry.
In universe, what reason is there for why spellcasters have to spend 8 hours before they can prepare spells again? Like, out of universe, there's the whole thing with Jack Vance, but in universe. What's the reason?
I mean, yeah, no, I couldn't tell you. I've heard some vague explanations thrown around in some settings about, uh, once you cast a spell, you forget it, so you have to restudy it. But other than that, it mostly seems like something that was implemented for the mechanical side rather than something that enhances the lore.
It was very much put in because Gygax and Arneson were fans of Jack Vance's work, especially the Dying Earth books. And again, that is a external reason. And to contrast that, are you familiar at all with Shadowrun?
Vaguely.
Shadowrun spellcasting has a spell drain rule, which is essentially fatigue damage when you use magic. And it goes out of its way to say using magic is going to tire you out. And it's represented through that spell drain, which is basically you taking non-lethal damage. You do it too much, you'll get knocked out, but still. Or in the same vein, the whole Perils of the Warp thing in whenever you do magic in whether it be Warhammer Fantasy or 40k. That is to hammer home the point that all magic is chaos magic, and messing around with chaos results in very, very bad things.
Yep. The very active casting magic is relying on either chance or opening a gateway to let chance spill out as an unintended consequence, with the winds of magic and calling upon the immaterium itself.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, bit of a Warhammer nerd as well, but
no, I certainly am as well and just a lore nerd period. Although
absolutely.
I do find that in some ways I find fantasy's lore more interesting than 40k's. I will admit a significant amount of bias because of how much I love the Gotrek and Felix books.
Yep. Absolutely. From what I've heard, they're the staple by which a lot of people come to love fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
I've only gotten into fantasy recently, but I do think that it is a more traditionally enjoyable lore experience, while 40k is more...
Mm-hmm.
It's snippets, it's bite-sized little pieces, but fantasy is a full-on lore. Anyways, continue.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
And I've spoken about how I find things like the Tomb Kings fascinating, with the fact that you have whole dynasties who have to be forced to exist at the same time, and since all of them are technically the rightful ruler, bullshit is inevitable.
Yep. Too many kings in the kitchen at one time, all coming back and laying claim to everything, is a huge, very good reason for them to not collaborate.
Yeah, the exception is if Cetra says you're going to collaborate, because Cetra is very much modeled after Alexander the Great, and is very much a case of he is going to get shit done whether you like it or not. And if you don't like it, he's just going to use your head as ammunition for his next conquest.
Yep.
There's also the fact that his full list of titles takes about 2 hours to read.
Good fucking lord, yeah, no.
King
Cetra of the 50 million titles. What shall we do?
Yeah.
What I tell you to.
I think one of the funnier parts is using him as a lord in Total War, and him being an out arrogant prick to the elves, even saying to a dark elf envoy, "Impress me with your cruelty."
Good lord.
But then again, considering who his biggest rival is, that being Nagash, the biggest asshole in Warhammer, a little arrogance is a bit warranted.
Yeah, fair. I'm just now realizing Cetra's arrogance in contrast to Zarek the Silent King's in 40k. Very interesting.
Yeah,
Is yeah. You have one guy who will shout his names to the heavens for 2 hours while he's charging at you into the setting sun, and then the other will dip out of the galaxy for a couple thousand years and still refuse to say anything even as the rest of the dynasties charge against him.
mhm. Though, if there's a parallel as far as just a recurring character that gets into a lot of shenanigans in the 40k universe, it has to be Caiaphas Cain, hero of the Imperium. Yes, you have to say the whole thing. It's like a Tribe Called Quest. You gotta say the whole thing.
Like a pimp named Slickback, Caiaphas Cain, hero of the Imperium.
Yeah, mostly because of the fact that it's playing a bit loose about whether or not he is a massive coward or if he just has imposter syndrome.
Yeah. No matter what he has, he's getting shit done, whether he likes it or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of his early exploits was he was assigned to a artillery battalion with the Valhallans. Figuring, okay, if I'm doing for artillery, then I'm going to be second line. I'm not going to have to be in the front lines. Then the Tyranids show up. He decides to make a beeline to try and get out. Ends up going right into a diversionary force of Tyranids, and now everybody thinks that instead of running away like a coward, he bravely got into a vehicle and charged to mark that there was a secondary wave coming in.
Caiaphas Cain bravely charging in the other direction.
So, and that is kind of the approach that he's gotten stuck with. Of he wants to just run off, but because of this reputation, he has to do more and more crazy heroics in order to keep up the facade.
Yep.
But I will admit that when it comes to just going on Warhammer for a bit, I find it a bit frustrating that even with the depth of the lore, when it comes to doing game adaptations, it's only rarely that we get an attempt that isn't a strategy game.
Yeah. I completely agree. We've had a lot of Space Marine focus. I will say the Rogue Trader was a very nice change of pace, but that was a nice breeze in an overall typhoon of Space Marine content. I think that we need more risk-taking games, but I do understand game development is it's a big enterprise and a huge investment, so you can't exactly make Fire Warrior for the PS2 and, be okay if it doesn't make huge profits.
Yeah. I think some of it is Games Workshop needs to be a little more selective into who they hand the license to instead of just anybody within arm's reach.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are more fitting of it than others, but I'm surprised that it took so long for a more boomer shooter like thing like Bolt Gun to come to pass.
Absolutely.
And don't get me wrong, I love Bolt Gun to death, but I'm just surprised it took that long. And
yeah.
I have argued for the longest time that what I would like to see is just a FPS focused on the Imperial Guard, kind of in the style of Battlefield. Specifically Battlefield Modern Combat, which had that whole jumping between characters thing.
Yeah. Honestly, I could see it kind of taking inspiration from the game Enlisted, the free-to-play one where you can swap between squad members.
Yeah.
I think that would be a great direction to go in. Another one would be, forgetting the name of it now, but there's a whole game where there's a backline aspect of it where players can focus on both being in the field sending out squads in the front line, but also having to manage the logistical aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that could be very interesting in an Imperial Guard setting. I mean,
Yeah. But I understand the emphasis on Space Marines, but uh, at the same time am reminded of when back with Star Wars Galaxies, how Ralph Koster was doing everything in his power to not put Jedi in the game until he was forced to by the powers that be.
Yep.
And his reasoning for it was actually sound. He felt it would be an alpha class that everybody would be chasing. And since Star Wars Galaxies was doing a very sandbox style of MMO, that would create problems, and well, it did.
Yeah.
Which I think is also why trying to do like a Warhammer 40k MMO is going to create more problems than it solves, just because the universe is too big. Yes, we had Eternal Crusade, but that just proves the point.
It just sucks that either it's super big ventures that don't pay off well, and then they take that as a sign of failure, which is, probably in the general gaming market. But I think that things like Bolt Gun, Rogue Trader, and to an extent, Shoota's Blood and Teeth are proof that, you don't need Space Marines to have a good Warhammer game.
Have you ever tried Daka Squadron?
I have not.
That was another orc-based one that was basically taking the orcs and putting them in a shmup.
Yeah. Yep. Oh my god.
I
think that orcs are just, in general, if you want to make a generic FPS, orcs are going to be the guys.
Mm-hmm.
But, I'd love to hear your take. What do you think a Chaos game would be like?
I feel like a decent Chaos game. I'm putting in the caveat of not doing another strategy or board game like approach.
Absolutely.
Because as we've kind of hinted at, that has been done to death and back. The approach that I am thinking of is honestly something akin to like Overlord, the game, not the anime. Let me clarify.
Yeah.
In the sense that you are the head of a chaos cult trying to become a champion, and dealing with all the backstabbery that goes along with that. Essentially taking Necromunda and flipping it.
Interesting.
In that sense of you're trying to create a chaos warband and gaining favor, conquest, all of that good stuff to eventually become a full-on champion.
Yeah.
And in the process dealing with the backstabbing, because you've got so many other warbands wanting to become champions themselves.
I mean, absolutely. I think that another interesting approach to take, if you don't mind me going off for just a second here.
Oh, go right ahead.
Yeah. I think that a largely misunderstood part of Chaos is corruption, which in a lot of games they have to relegate it to, this is something that'll make your character, it'll give you gifts of chaos, but it's just a statistic. I think that a management game, something like Cult of the Lamb, where You have the dungeon delving as well, where, you could go raid Imperial supplies or go assassinate some planetary governor, but also trying to actively push people into chaos and benefiting from them.
Mhm.
That would be my ideal chaos game.
Yeah, I think the only thing that might be tricky with that is accommodating it for all four of the big four.
Absolutely. I mean, Lord knows, trying to figure out Nurgle corruption mechanics.
Oh. Yeah. I mean, not obviously, Korn is going to be easy to figure out, but Tzeentch or Nurgle, or how you do Slaanesh in a way that isn't going to get you an AO rating.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
I have often told people when it comes to Slaanesh to instead of thinking of the more X-rated aspect, Slaanesh is not far removed from the Cenobites in Hellraiser.
Absolutely.
And yes, I have completely ripped off Pinhead to have him be a champion of Slaanesh at one point. Legally distinct Pinhead, but you get the point.
Yeah. Those aren't nails, they're butcher snails. It's whatever.
Hmm. Because well, that whole concept of his fixation on desire, that is very much Slaanesh.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the god that was created through sheer murder fucking by the elves.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
What happens when you leave the elves alone for millions of years with their heightened psychic potential? Nothing good. But yeah, I think that another thing that people forget is the Slaanesh is access in everything, including study, practice, and experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
Baby is vile. Perfect example. Dude does not engage in the TOS things, the TOS violations that we can't say here.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't even really indulge in drugs. He's just experimenting, trying to recreate perfect things like Primarchs and super powerful warriors. And hell, he does. To the point where Slaanesh themselves is scared of him, the progress he's making.
Yeah.
But he's not the sex guy, he's the guy who got so good at genetics. It's scary.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, like, with sorry, go on.
And same thing goes with the infamous thing with Honso and the demon Kulaba.
Oh fuck.
Yeah, how could I not bring that up?
You could have not. It's alright, but I still don't get why. That's not an Iron Warrior's thing. That's not something an Iron Warrior would think of. Except for Hanzo, that weirdo. But, yeah, for anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about, I don't recommend independent research. It's not worth it. Chaos is a corruption in and out of game.
Yeah. I will simply say that it involved an attempt to try and make more Gene Seed. The attempt was somewhat successful in the worst ways possible, but anytime somebody tries to mess around with genetics to create new Gene Seed, there's always a catch. Hell, even the Imperium found that out the hard way with the Cursed Founding.
Yep. Except for the new Marines. Fuck's name slipping by me.
Yeah, the whole Primaris thing, which I'm still not 100% on the whole this one tech priest from centuries ago had cracked the code.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, Belisarius calls an exception to a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I would dare say he's probably smarter than Bile on just account of, if you can shove enough libraries in your brain, you're probably going to be good enough. But with the Primaris Marines in general, I think that they did have to dilute it with human gene seed. I may be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But even that's not a whole new engineering. It's just refining and diluting it. And some new equipment to go with it.
There is good reason why the Imperium doesn't try and do brand new stuff all that often. Because a breakthrough in a brand new invention could be a one-way trip to having Tzeentch demons showing up.
Or the Men of Iron again, which is a very valid concern. But
yeah. But when it comes to Warhammer and TTRPGs, we have a interesting if tumultuous history. There were the FFG games, which I have pretty much all of them. But I'd appreciate with those ones, instead of trying to do Warhammer as a whole, it's instead each of them focused on a particular aspect.
Yeah. I think with the FFG games, I respect that they delineated each game line to be a separate experience. I really do respect it, but the differentiations between the cores in each setting can be very confusing. I think that if they just had a core book and then did many supplements, that could be good, but treating each game line as if it's as its own kind of core book I don't know, it's a mixed bag, because it lets them do different things with different systems, have different basic aspects that change the experience, which is good. But it doesn't mesh.
Yeah,
they don't mesh with each other, but they try.
Yeah, there were some issues trying to if you wanted to have like Rogue Trader characters interact with Dark Heresy characters and the like, of what would be tier 1 in one system versus another. And I think Wrath and Glory had some attempts to try and deal with that, although when I say that, I'm obviously referring to the version that is currently available that Cubicle 7 did. Originally, Wrath and Glory was handled by Ulysses Spiel, who were the same people behind the Dark Eye, and it was fine, but it did feel like some parts were a bit off. Then Cubicle 7 got a hold of it because I guess Games Workshop wanted Cubicle 7 to be the guys when it comes to Warhammer TTRPGs, and it turned out significantly better.
Yeah.
And hey, Cubicle 7 managed to get me to care about Age of Sigmar, so that's something.
Yeah. Still need to look through Soulbound myself, but it does look very interesting.
I covered it a few years ago. It is a pretty good system. And it's another notch on Cubicle 7's track record, because they have a lot of bangers in their library.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard good things about the new Imperius Maledictum game.
Yeah, which is more or less the successor to the FFG games, since it's using a D100 approach.
Yeah.
But something that is very amusing to me is, some years back, I was able to talk with Graham Davis on this channel. Graham Davis has done a lot of things Warhammer, but one of the big notches on his belt is being the guy behind fantasy roleplay. And one of the things that he had said was, at one point early on, they were going to try and use the same D6 die pool setup that the war game does, until they painted themselves into a corner and had to blow it up. And I come back to that because when I think of other war games that made the jump to TTRPG, none of them tried to really replicate the resolution systems, except BattleTech. BattleTech is insistent on using the exact same resolution system in the war game as in the MechWarrior role-playing games.
Do you think that's a good or bad thing? If you had to put a pin on it.
I think using that 2d6 approach to try, I can see the appeal of it, but the problem is if you want to run something that does not involve the big stompy mechs, and there is enough of a contingent with the political machinations within the BattleTech universe to justify that, you start to have problems. And a lot of it, because BattleTech is a very lore-dense universe in and of itself. And a lot of that density is just as much about the big stompy robots as it is about the political machinations between the great houses or the clans or the periphery or even the deep periphery. And the approach, and using a system that was built for the mech combat for that, I'm not entirely convinced was the best idea. I think instead using it should have used its own thing. Of course, when it comes to BattleTech and TTRPGs, I find myself frustrated because in every single system that's been out there, there's some kind of catch. But the big one is trying to do the entirety of the history of BattleTech in one book. If it takes several hours just to do a whole era for Sven Vanderplank's retrospective series, trying to do that in one book is kind of pushing it.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't delved deep into. I haven't even really touched BattleTech yet myself, but I've heard a lot, and that there's a lot of lore depth, which trying to sum that up in one book, I can imagine can be frustrating for dedicated fans of the series.
Yeah. To take that approach that you mentioned earlier, I think because MechWarrior 1 through 3 had all the problems that I had with Traveler and all the problems I have with games that came out of the late 80s throughout a good chunk of the 90s in terms of just adding way too many skills or way too much stuff in the name of realism. This was a problem back then. It's the reason why the first Alien TTRPG I've stated many times I will not run. Not the one by Free League, that one's great, but the original back in '93, which was using Phoenix Command, which is a game I do not care for. But then there was A Time of War, which tried to go a full point-based approach, which had way too many traps and was trying to do all of the arcs at once. And then there was Destiny, which was a little bit too simple for its own good. So with each iteration, there's been some kind of catch, but the big one has been trying to do everything at once. I think that if I was given the keys to the kingdom to do a BattleTech TTRPG, I think I'd probably take the same approach that something like Edge of the Empire did for Star Wars, where they'd made the deliberate choice to focus on the Outer Rim for their first outing and not address any of the other stuff until they were more comfortable with their system. And in this regard, I would focus primarily on right out the gate, the Succession Wars. Specifically, like the third or fourth Succession Wars, which is around the time that the canon part of the timeline was supposed to be for the longest time and for a lot of BattleTech media, anyways. But in doing that, you have different factions. You have the whole mercenary thing. So there's a foundation to build around without bringing in some of the messy stuff like the clans.
Yeah. Hmm.
The point is, instead of trying to get everything at once, just focus on a few things and then expand outward from there.
Yeah. And I think that kind of notion ties back into the Warhammer, which they did indeed split off into a bunch of different directions with the possible kinds of campaigns you could have.
Mm-hmm.
I could have seen them going with just one book and saying, oh, here's all the talents for humans and rogue traders and inquisitors, and here's how to run these kind of campaigns. If they tried to fit that all into one book,
I think that was the plan originally. Because originally all
Really?
there was just Dark Heresy, which had the premise of you are acolytes working under an inquisitor in this particular sector of the galaxy.
Yeah. Which is, I think, one of the best ways you can approach Warhammer at a human level without having to drown someone in lore.
Mm-hmm.
Other than being a guardsman, but that also comes with some caveats. But being an inquisitorial acolyte is a great way to both have experienced people come in, people who may know the lore already, but also people who might not, and just know the grimdark basics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say either that or maybe Necromunda.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although if I'm being honest, Necromunda is Mega City 1 in all but name.
Yeah.
And
it's a setting within itself.
Yeah. But because of the constant gang violence, there's a foundation to build around.
Yeah.
And being a hive city, there's floors upon floors to the point where because of the size and scope of hive cities, you can pretty much put just about anything in there and make it work.
Yep.
And just say this is a city complex on steroids and also a complete shithole. Actually, saying that a hive city is a complete shithole is a insult to shitholes.
Yeah. Just stack 20-something New Yorks on top of each other, bury 5 or 6 Detroits under them, and then you have the Sump, where you could have the mutants darker than anything in the reaches of space hideout.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But admittedly, when I've looked into role-playing games over the years, and you did kind of touch on this when you brought up your experience with Mutants and Masterminds.
Yeah.
There is one problem that I've been having that has only recently been addressed, and I think it could be addressed a bit more. And that is the new player experience. A lot of people in the design space and in the player space, I think have forgotten about the mindset that they were at when they were just starting out, because they've been doing it for so long that they don't have that perspective. And
yeah.
Stanley once said every comic is someone's first, and the same thing can apply to role-playing games, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It's for that reason that you're probably familiar with the Fate games, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I've been critical of the fact that there's little guidance when it comes to the aspect system that so much of Fate is built around.
Yeah.
With the fact that it doesn't outright specify what would be pushing your luck when it comes to aspect entries, but just let the table figure it out, which is cute and all when everybody's on point and knows specifically what they want to do.
Yeah.
But whenever I bring that up, I inevitably get somebody going, the game trusts the table to be able to figure it out. I'm like, that's a cold comfort for somebody who's just getting into it and has to figure out, okay, where's the line?
Yep. I can say, as someone who absolutely loves the aspect system, I love it in theory, because in practice, it's always going to be a series of trials to figure out where the line is, what it's going to be. And unfortunately, the book leaves it open, which is respectable in text, but in practice, it's goddamn difficult.
Mhm.
Aspects as a system where you can take a part of the narrative and apply narrative leverage onto it and also make it an issue that can bring in consequences. I love that, but it's not something I can't recommend Fate to new players, and I would dare say I can't recommend Fate to people who haven't played Fate, which is ultimately I respect the system,
Yeah,
but the system needs you to know the system to play the system.
which is
It's
certainly an Inception moment.
yeah, absolutely. It's recursive. It's an Ouroboros of you'll play Fate better once you've played Fate, which I do believe, but also is a damn hard sell.
I will note a few exceptions. One of them being Tianxia.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
In fact, whenever I've roasted the aspect system with Fate and some of its apologists, I'll call them what they are,
Yeah.
I've said, okay, I'm taking the Tianxia system, I'm putting it in a bubble, and I'm putting it right over here in the corner. So everything I say does not reflect on Tianxia because it's in its bubble.
Yep.
Because it does give proper examples for the aspect system, and since a significant part of that is tied into your particular martial arts, even more so.
Yeah. By giving a mechanical foundation to what kind of things aspects can do outside of just the aspect system, they give you a point of reference that you can apply to other things as well. Yeah. Especially with the martial arts system, which I absolutely love. But
another example that I often bring up when it comes to this, I call this sort of thing blank check design or blank check mechanics, since it's exactly what it sounds like on the tin. And what I have, this is where I bring up 13th Age. 13th Age has a part of its character creation called the one unique thing, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is this one unique thing that you have to your character that's not meant to... It is meant to have a bit of flavor to your character, but it's not meant to have crunch to your character. And within the core book, there is a 2-page spread going into this exact thing I'm referring to. You know, where they give a bunch of examples. Some of them are players creating the stories. Some of them are called cool idea, consequences later. Some of them are seemingly innocuous. Some of them are considered too much for first level. Some are deliberately pushing it. And with each of the examples they give, they go into a bit more detail. And because of that, you have something of a line regarding what the one unique thing is, and more importantly, what it isn't.
This may just be me, but I think that one of the things Fate kind of falls into, and this is more so of not necessarily an issue with the system itself, but they give a lot of examples of what an aspect could be, but they make it hard to give a lot of examples of what bad aspects could be, because they want to focus on the more positive parts of the system, which is good, but if you don't set those limits in the text, it leaves too much to interpretation, and that makes it confusing or easily exploitable.
I've seen some argue that it's done in such a broad way because Fate is technically a universalist system.
Yeah.
Which I would be able to go with if it weren't for the fact that Cortex Prime has a similar thing with its distinctions, and it doesn't have that problem.
Yeah.
So I really think it comes down to the designer, and I think that's the reason I certainly see third-party Fate stuff here and there, but I don't see as much as I was seeing a few years ago.
Yeah.
And I definitely think the way Evil handled things like the Fate of Cthulhu debacle didn't exactly help matters.
Yeah.
Where they tried to make it this poor man's Terminator story in the name of reclaiming um the Cthulhu mythos from H.P. Lovecraft, and
Yeah.
while at the same time calling the game Fate of Cthulhu, which you hear that name and I think you could reasonably assume, okay, it's Call of Cthulhu, but using the Fate system instead of Chaosium's basic role playing.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think that they definitely took it in a unique angle, but it wasn't what people were expecting from the title, which is that's a big part of any game.
Yeah.
If you give a premise, but then that premise isn't matched by the advertising, it can be more negative than positive, even if what they have is good. For example, I think the idea of, on a conceptual level, time travel to stop Cthulhu, that's fun. That's a neat twist on the basic formula of the Gloom and Doom cult prevention angle. That can be unfortunately overdone. But you don't market that as Fate of Cthulhu.
mm-hmm. Like, Cthulhu Tech recently wrapped up its Kickstarter for its second edition of a sort. One that is, instead of trying to be a kitchen sink, focused more on the taggers. But you don't see that problem there because it's not trying to advertise itself as Call of Cthulhu but blank. It is Cthulhu Tech is certainly using the mythos, but it is doing something on its own with it.
Yeah.
This in the same way that nobody's going to confuse either of them for, say, the Laundry Files, which can dip into that mythos, but is clearly doing its own thing, or even Trail of Cthulhu, which is getting a second edition, and that's much like its predecessor, using the Gumshoe system, which is doubling down on investigative play. That's what Gumshoe was built for.
I mean, yeah. That's, I think, one of the prime examples of what it says on the tin.
Mm-hmm.
And also introducing some unique stuff without forsaking the core concept. I think one of the best parts of that system is the fact of you give them the clues straight up. No skill rolls, nothing. You tell them what they need to know and let them come to conclusions through the skill rolls, which I've always loved as a principle of any mystery game.
Yeah. I remember that the Gumshoe system was designed out of a frustration with how if you fail a knowledge skill roll, that just leads to a narrative stop.
Yeah.
Admittedly, some of that can be mitigated with the fail forward philosophy that we do see more of these days.
Yeah. Where failure is not... They explicitly say failure is not meant to stop the story, it's meant to move it in a different direction.
Yeah.
Or create a setback, which I think is another great branch of that whole I wouldn't say narrative movement, but the trend to acknowledge it.
Pretty much. And
go on, sorry.
I would... So you did touch on something when it comes to advertising, because I'm reminded of when I covered Fabula Ultima last year. And the way it advertised itself, as well as the Power Rangers RPG, was something that played a factor in how I assessed both games, and I was very harsh on both games. I realized with my take on Fabula Ultima, I was in the minority, but I've never done things based on popular opinion.
Yeah.
Because
I think that even if I were to disagree with you with whatever take you may have, you're entitled to that opinion. Games, especially with role-playing games, perspective is a big part of the individual experience.
At the very least, I can make it... Because my approach when it comes to the whole entitled to your opinion is, I've said, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. And at the very least, if I'm going to be saying something that's going to play a factor in someone's purchasing decisions, I need to say more than just, that's my opinion. I need to go into the whys. And when I covered Fabula Ultima, I saw a lot of the glowing praise was coming from people for whom this was their first experience with this kind of thing of doing console style RPGs in TTRPG form. But it was not my first experience with this kind of thing. Far from it. And I wanted to cover it from the perspective of somebody who's been around the block with this concept and how it contrasts with other people who've made the attempt. And even more so when on the back of the book it says, live out your JRPG fantasy. I'm like, all right, that's our premise. And I found that it only really works if your JRPG fantasy is solely in that airship laden Magipunk approach of like Final Fantasy 6 or 14.
Yeah.
Maybe some of the Tales of games if you're lucky. I'm aware that they've expanded into certain genres with the Fantasy Atlas expansions, but expansions don't count.
Yeah.
And that was the angle that I built my assessment around.
Yeah.
Because you remember when I talked about earlier about how that whole shit or get off the pot thing regarding fantasy, regarding D&D? Like,
yeah,
a big frustration of that is D&D's adherents keep telling me for decades now that you can use it to run any kind of fantasy. Okay, then why is it that the races, classes, equipment, spells, combat systems, monsters, etc. all skew towards a Western European pastiche?
Yeah. I don't think that D&D, this is a very, with the advent of 5e is kind of not a universal system, but it is the poster boy for the community, for better or for ill. But it does not do any fantasy, and people will try their damnedest, and sometimes it's really good, but ultimately they're trying to fit extra pieces into a square-shaped hole.
Mm-hmm.
The effort is respectable, and I can see what you're going for, but 5e may not be every fantasy you need it to be. Rarely is it.
And some of that is due to that whole half in, half out thing.
Yeah.
But a counterpoint that I bring with this sort of thing is a game from a few years back called Fantasy Craft, which it happens to be one of my favorite TTRPGs. Fantasy Craft took the 3.5 setup, blew everything up, and built it from the ground up on the premise of being setting agnostic and one that could build around different subgenres of fantasy, especially through its campaign qualities system, to the point where you don't even need magic if you don't want to have it.
That's fun.
And hell, the Legend Edition project, we're not building around any one FF, we're building around the mythos. That was a conscious decision we made so that it would be easy for someone to take it in whatever direction they wanted to. If they wanted to go more steampunk, they could do that. If they want to go more futuristic, they could do that too.
And with Final Fantasy, that is extremely important because it's one of those instances where the franchise itself can differ so much in terms of theming, mythos, and genre in entry to entry.
Mm-hmm.
You have to make a very basic foundation and then apply modifiers onto it, and then let people run it their own way. Final Fantasy 1 is a basic fantasy story. Go out, kill the Demon King, maybe throw in a little bit of time travel.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it takes a lot to do a lot of different things.
Yeah, and the original FF, if I'm being honest, was essentially a kit bash of elements between Ultima and Dragon Quest.
Yep.
But I've done my fair share of research on the history of what people call JRPGs and what I call console style RPGs. And everything goes back to wizardry. Wizardry was really popular in Japan, to the point of Japanese knockoffs showing up. A lot of early console RPGs having that first-person perspective on combat is because of the Wizardry influence. And Dragon Quest was an attempt to do Wizardry, but simplified for the Famicom.
Yeah.
And when it comes to like, I've covered and I've gone through a lot of the Final Fantasy fan games over the years, and a good amount of them skew towards the SNES era. Which, don't get wrong, I like plenty of games from that era. I enjoy 4, 5, and 6. But you've got whole generations who have more of an attachment to the PlayStation eras, for instance.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
If you're presenting a game like Fabula Ultima, which also leans into a similar kind of era, similar kind of vibe, to a table who is more fans of, say, FF7,
yeah,
there's going to be some problems that you're going to have to house rule.
Yeah.
And I don't think saying just house rule it is sufficient.
Yeah. That's putting a responsibility on your consumer, which, with any kind of product, is very iffy.
Well, think about how much shit Bethesda gets for their buggy-ass games that they depend on modders to bail them out with.
Fucking Starfield was so bad they couldn't even get the modders to bail them out on that one. Source code was borked.
Which I knew it was going to be. I remember when I covered that extended preview of Starfield, and they said, this could be very interesting if they can pull it off. Those were my exact words.
Yep.
Of course, just the gun designs alone are enough to give me an aneurysm. Like having a shotgun that somehow has round shells and square holes. Like, what the fuck?
What the fuck?
And I play a lot of science fiction games. I should be used to dumbass gun designs, but I have a line.
Yeah.
And when you go just realistic enough, but also make it ridiculous in other ways, you're crossing that line.
Yeah. And like, if you're gonna go ridiculous and go all the way. Like, for example, imagine if you had all those weird-ass gun designs in Starfield, but then you realize all the bullets are in square casings.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be more interesting than just, oh yeah, use the same bullet model from Fallout 4? Not saying that they did that, but for hyperbole's sake.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that with anything, if they wanted to go all out, they should have gone all out, but then I look at the Starborn. The Starborn.
I will simply say Emil Pagliarello is a fucking hack.
Yeah.
He got his start as the writer of the Dark Brotherhood storyline in Oblivion. Then and was also responsible for some of the writing in Fallout 3. He became lead writer with Fallout 4. And he was the lead writer as well for Starfield. Not only is he shit, he's that smug kind of shit who thinks that his shit don't stink.
Yeah.
Just
the kind of shit where it's your fault if you don't get it.
Yeah, and I remember some of the responses he was giving to critiques when he was getting blown out for some of the story decisions in Fallout 3 and 4, and he was being very condescending. In a sorry you didn't fully understand it kind of way. And there's one thing with Fallout 4 that even knowing it as long as I have, I'm still aghast that this was even considered. He wanted to try and integrate the magic system from Skyrim into Fallout 4 under the guise of radiation witches.
What the fuck?
God is my witness. That was the plan. He outright said it at a conference years ago. The only reason it didn't, the reason he wanted to do it was because Fallout 4 is taking place in Massachusetts, in the Boston area. What's also in the Massachusetts area is Salem witch trials, all of that. But the reason why it didn't happen wasn't because someone said, this is a fucking stupid idea, don't do it, but because that spellcasting system was in an older version of the code that was no longer compatible. But just the fact that the idea got that far. If I was on the development team for a post-apocalyptic game and somebody says, hey, let's do radiation witches. And I'm like, we've never done magic in this setting. Why would we start now? Get the fuck out.
Yeah. And it's like, sometimes you take an idea so far that you have to, like... That's the kind of idea that would have to be retconned in the next game as, no, it wasn't actually magic. That whole thing was a hallucination. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, the problem is, even in his own writing, he's not willing to be consistent. Like the whole thing of whether or not ghouls need food. Sometimes, even in the same game, it contradicts.
Yeah.
And I remember a long time ago talking with a director who had worked on a lot of television. This was not something I did as an interview proper, but just something I was in a workshop with them, and I was asking questions. And he brought up a concept that I think a lot of designers should have. Whether you're designing a film, whether you're designing a TV show, whether you're designing a video game or tabletop game. And that is the concept of a series Bible. Now, this is not a new thing in television. This is a thing that's been around for decades.
Yeah.
But it is basically some sort of document, some sort of reference point that is there to keep everything consistent.
Yeah.
With Legend Edition, we had that with our pillars. They were meant to be our all roads lead to Rome regarding how we design the game, and anything we do has to reflect those pillars. Those being mythos over setting, customization is king, and the four-phase structure. If it didn't fit within those pillars, then we didn't do it.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
You have a pillar that serves as the basis that keeps everybody on track.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And it's because of that that I feel that we were able to avoid things like the bloat problems that can happen in some designs. Because I've seen some people go, oh, I'm making my own game, and then they are in perpetual development because they end up waffling about on things instead of nailing down a direction and sticking to it.
Yep. Don't I get it? Yeah, no. Sorry.
I think one of the big pet peeves I have is when somebody spends way too much time on trying to figure out what the right die mechanic is as the first thing that they're trying to write.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. If I may. Recently, I've been working on a homebrew system for one of a smaller series of games that I did as a very informal set of one-shots. And originally, I was using what I wanted to have be a mix between the storyteller system from New World of Darkness and the Fates systems aspects. That didn't really mesh well. It did not mesh well at all, because trying to assign numerical bonuses for a system that is meant to be in a game where the numbers don't really matter beyond do you succeed or not, how well do you do it? in combining that with the World of Darkness dice system, which is meant to be more closely balanced by having very strict bonuses, penalties, the way I did it didn't really work out. I've been in the process of redesigning that whole system for several months now, which...
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. I will readily admit I'm falling into the same trap you just described, where the gameplay and the lore and the setting get all so jumbled up that it gets hard to decide on any one of them.
Mm-hmm. If I'm being honest, I think because Fate, of course, uses the fudge dice, which is, as an aside, a bit hilarious to me when I see people bitching about the symbol-based die you see in Genesis, and I'm like, motherfucker, you play Fate. Don't throw stones in that glass house.
Yeah.
And
I will say, a Fate die, they acknowledge that Fate dice are just D6s, but D3s pretty much.
Yeah. I know that there's the die ladder approach as well, but I rarely see anyone use it because even they admit that it's ridiculously swingy.
Yeah.
But when it comes to that approach, I think there is a way to integrate them, but the integration can't be to the letter of things, but more to the spirit of it.
Yeah.
Now, integrating something like the aspect system, that's something that can easily be done. The tricky part is, the storyteller system very much relies on that attribute skill relationship, whereas Fate mostly has the skill pyramid, and that's it. I think when it comes to it, you could easily have. I think a better approach might, instead of trying to use a success-based approach, having something akin to a range, something akin to the setup that you see in Zen Never Dies, where instead of trying to roll high or roll low, you're trying to roll within a set range based on your abilities. That is one particular angle that could be done.
Interesting.
Is I think what's important, especially when doing that sort of system fusion, is figure out, okay, what is the thing that is the appeal with the individual systems.
Yeah.
I remember seeing that with Heroes Against Darkness, which was a free game that was one of my earliest reviews, that was taking elements of the first 4 editions of D&D and fusing them. And he listed out what elements from each edition he was taking. Like from 4th, he was taking the whole defenses instead of saving throws concept, and some of the tactical movement. From 3rd, taking in the customization and so on. It's been a while since I read through the article where he went into that, but that's the gist. So I do think it's gonna take a bit of experimenting to get to the point, but I think it can be done just with a different approach. Again, spirit of the concept rather than the letter. There was one game that tried to go straight to the letter when it came to doing that mixing of systems, and that was Fusion, spelled with a Z.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Which was trying to mix the interlock system from our Talsorian games with the hero system. And
how did that turn out?
It was a mess. Especially when you have 3 different die resolution mechanics in the same book.
Yeah. Ultimately, I think that the lesson that can be derived from this is, if you're going to fuse things, consider how you're consider, are you trying to smash mechanics together, or are you trying to take inspiration from both? And I do mean inspiration in the most literal sense, not just taking pieces from each.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, going with the spirit of what you're trying to achieve and having the mechanics work into that is better than saying, I want these 2 mechanics together, and then I'll consider how the spirit fits into it. Doesn't work like that. Ultimately, it's very hard to do one, much more straightforward to do the other.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that, if you don't mind me transitioning, I think that there is a system that combines the spirit and the mechanics very, very well. I think that we briefly talked about it in our chats, Exalted, which has been one of my recent hyperfixations.
Yeah, although I will admit I'm not all that high on Exalted 3rd Edition.
Very fair.
The big reason for that is I feel that Exalted 3rd Edition kind of missed the point by trying so hard to scrub out. It felt like it was trying to scrub out a lot of the anime-ness out of Exalted, and trying to present it in a way that seems more like a D&D campaign setting.
Yeah. Sorry.
That was the exact thing that Exalted was trying to avoid from day one. It had specifically stated that it wanted to not do a Tolkien-style fantasy.
Yep. Coming back into that whole idea of the core design philosophy, from what I've heard, Exalted First Editions was... Oh, God. It was very specifically avoid the Tolkien tropes, which, as it turns out, a lot of Western fantasy is derived from. So they took a lot of Eastern mythology, folklore, concepts from there, and even some, further, not exactly Far East, but, other European influences. Nordic mythology, Scandinavian, going in a different direction than Tolkien by any means possible.
Yeah.
Which...
And a further case in point with that was the peak of Exalted was 2nd edition. And with both 1st and 2nd edition, when it came to the visual presentation, they had hired artists who had more of a manga leaning. Like for 1st edition, they hired groups like the Imaginary Friends art group, and for 2nd edition, they managed to snag Udon.
Yep. Which I believe they started in 2nd edition using comics rather than text blurbs, as is traditional for a lot of those products.
Yeah, with a lot of the books in 2nd edition, there were these mini comics throughout. Some of them very much tied into each other. And of course, to drum up hype for the release of 2nd edition proper, there was a whole comic surrounding it.
Yeah. Yep.
And I feel that 3rd edition, even though it lists certain anime in the influences part of the book, I feel like it doesn't commit to that because things like the "and I'll form the head" part of the storyteller section aren't present.
Yep. I think that 3rd edition is trying to wean back on some of the anime influences, and again, I am not as experienced as many other people who've talked about the Exalted setting and history and design philosophy in the field, but from what I understand, 2nd edition leaned into the anime part of the aesthetic very heavily, which I think contributed in part to its popularity in certain circles. It was like, this is the crazy wuxia anime game, where you have Avatar dragon bloods and the fate-bending celestial bureaucrats of the sidereals and all that. And third edition is definitely trying to wean off of that overtly anime influence. Which I understand, but also I think it was one of the things that made it second edition so unique in the scene.
That and also made it unique just in contrast with other fantasy games. Period. And what really hammered that home was, someone had asked Rich, the lead designer, who is kind of an idiot, why Magitech was taken out of third edition. Because Magitech was a big part of second edition. And his response was, and I'm semi-paraphrasing, Exalted is wuxia and mythology. Magitech doesn't factor into it.
I can see where he's coming from, but also it's hard to say that when the previous edition of the game leaned so hard into things like the first stage, Imperial War Walkers. It kind of had a Warhammer 40k-esque, the things that were lost and the artifacts left behind. Hell, dungeon crawling isn't just your going into some old king's tomb, it's a first stage tomb with mechanical bodyguards that are fully sentient. It's like...
in some cases, it's probably your tomb.
Yeah. Fucking, you could go into the tomb where your solar life was buried, and it'll be a ruined apartment complex that had full plumbing and internet access.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that saying Exalted is such and such is very hard to say in general. You could say we want to go into a more traditional fantasy genre aesthetic in third edition. That I could understand. But saying it is wuxia and mythology and saying that is somehow incompatible with the Magitech aesthetic is, I think, very limiting. Exalted second edition, reading through all the old books, has been crazy in seeing the diversity of things you could find.
Yeah, to me, it demonstrated a couple things. One, a misunderstanding of wuxia, because there are plenty of wuxia stories that have Magitech in them, or some even go full cyberpunk. I've seen that.
Yep.
Since wuxia means martial hero. There's a lot that goes into wuxia as a storytelling motif, but I think when he was referring to wuxia, he was thinking of it more in the classical Chinese literature kind of approach. The problem is that there's nothing outright saying that that if you're writing a wuxia story, it has to take place in a certain dynasty. In fact, most wuxia stories are kind of non-committal about what dynasty that they take place in, unless it actually matters.
Yeah.
To the point where the martial world is treated as a separate thing compared to normal politics.
Yeah. And you also have some wuxia stories that go fully into a completely different genre or aesthetic. Like, for example, I saw a webcomic recently that was wuxia but with gunslingers in a fantasy Chinese Wild West.
Mm-hmm.
And that is valid. You could have wuxia in mecha if they have big old swords and they're fighting on behalf of their young masters for a clan of mecha pilots. That can be wuxia.
Yeah,
but
you know what's one mecha series that is very wuxia, even if it doesn't say it?
Do tell.
G Gundam.
Ooh, very fair.
They don't outright say it, but in terms of a lot of the motifs within it, it is very much the case. And even beyond the specifics, I rejected the premise of, it's just wuxia and mythology on the sheer principle of how dismissive that sounds. Yeah. It is akin to saying, we can do this thing and say Doctor Who because it's a kids show. No, who cares? That is more or less what you're telling me when of course, if there was an episode of Doctor Who that tried that stunt and got a lot of blowback. It was an episode called Fear Her, and the guy who wrote the episode tried to do the whole. I didn't write the episode for adults. I wrote it for kids, and Chuck Sonnenberg, aka SF Debris, had the best response, saying, "I didn't know you could do that. That is awesome. So I'm going to rip this episode a new one, and if you feel obliged to protest that, well, too bad. It wasn't meant for you." Just throwing that argument right back in his face.
Yeah.
And saying that it's just two things is, especially when you're dealing with a TTRPG setting, is incredibly reductionist.
Yeah.
I mean, we've brought up Warhammer plenty of times, and if someone said Warhammer is just Space Marines, you and I would have a fit.
Absolutely. I think I'd be entitled to give him a good old Ultramarine style deck in the face for that.
Mm-hmm. Because not just when it comes to the different races, but the fact that you have space opera, you have gothic tragedy, you have horror, you have cosmic horror. The Eisenhorn series of books take a more detective noir approach to the idea of an inquisitor. There's a whole lot of things that you can do genre and tone wise in that setting, and Creation in Exalted is not far removed from that. Yes, there is the over the topness, but there's also the political machinations and all of that. The Blessed Isle is pretty much chock full of that, because the Scarlet Empress, who basically was running a good chunk of Creation up until that point, just up and disappeared, and everybody's trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah.
Some people are making power plays, other people are like, we need to wait and see, and the folks outside of what's known as the realm are reacting in their own way as well. Some people are like, well, if she's not around, then we can go fuck your shit up, and nobody's going to be able to bring up those defense systems. And other people are like, well, we don't want anything to do with you anymore, so we're doing our own thing, so fuck off.
Nope. Ultimately, the Scarlet Empress's departure opens up a lot of interesting things both inside and outside the realm.
Mm-hmm.
Including a continuance of political stuff. In fact, now it opens up the idea of more political stories, because you don't have a central authority figure. And one of the interesting things, I think, is the fact that they explicitly have designs and suggestions and little plot points that you could bring up for the inevitable realm civil war, which I always found fascinating about the dragon-blooded side of Exalted, is that all the stuff they give you is in preparation for an event that you may or may not get to play out. You get to choose.
Mm-hmm.
You can begin and end an entire campaign without bringing up the civil war that's coming up. Or you may just say, no, actually, you diffused it. Guess what? You bring the Scarlet Empress back. Good job.
Yeah. There was that whole Return of the Scarlet Empress adventure that hinted that an Age of Brass would be coming, but that never came to pass, because right around that time was when White Wolf was acquired by CCP Games and everything that happened in the aftermath of that.
Yep.
But also, I'm seeing Gizmo in the chat saying, so an inclusion on that spirit-themed storytelling above mechanics. Did I get that right? Not necessarily. Think of them as a yin and yang. They should flow into each other. A lot of people treat them as separate things when it's really a case where one feeds into the other.
Yeah.
But
I think that mechanics can inform storytelling. If they work well, the setting should inform the mechanics, and mechanics should influence the story. Sorry for cutting you off.
Yeah.
Go on.
But I know I'm not the only one who had that frustration of dialing back on the on the over-the-top aspects. Yeah. Because one of my dear friends on this channel, Joel Clark, created his own game, Lone Wolf Fist, kind of in response to that sort of thing.
Yeah.
and bringing in a lot of elements of Fist of the North Star in it. You're not going to see full on different types of exalts, but you're going to see. But the spirit is certainly there, and the recent expansion he's working on, Acid and Steel, very much is drawing upon the Infernal Exalted and the Autochthonians.
Ooh, good to hear.
Not in a one-to-one thing, obviously. His version of the Infernals has a very Buddhist and Hindu-inspired version of hell.
Ooh.
Whereas his version of the Autochthonians almost leans into a kind of rusty. I don't want to say steampunk, because that gives the wrong connotation. But just this idea of, I guess I'd liken it to the manga Blame, of just this massive machine. Which, as an aside, I won't say Blame is the best manga, but it is my favorite manga to read. Just read in complete silence is the best way to experience it, and it's something that I don't think can work as an anime.
Very fair. Honestly, with the state of the industry and the medium of animation as a whole, I think that there are some things that work better if they are static when you are reading them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's more that Blame very much builds itself on its sense of atmosphere.
Yeah.
And it's one of those, when it comes to more atmospheric books, whether they be novels or manga, the pacing is up to the reader. Whereas in something like an anime, the pacing is going to be up to the director. So something that could take a whole chapter's worth of just showcasing can be done in a few frames. You know, it's not a. It's one of those tricky things with adaptation, and I won't. When it comes to something like Exalted, them going whole hog into anime was certainly an act of timing. Because in the early 2000s, that was when the floodgates really started to open when it came to exposure to a wide variety of anime. That was when you had like 3 different companies in an arms race to license any anime that they could get.
It was a big exodus for the idea of anime as a medium and as a genre coming into the West.
Yeah. Before that, the closest thing that you had to, there were certainly a lot of attempts to do anime RPGs. You know, I've played things like Big Eye Small Mouth and the like, but a lot of them were focused on anime as if it was a genre as a whole. And I do liken that a lot to a lack of info at the time, or a limited amount of info. I think the one person who I think was ahead of the curve on that was once again Pondsmith, because he put out stuff like Teenagers from Outer Space and Mechton, which weren't about anime as a genre, but were about specific genres and subgenres.
Yep.
And I think I've always felt that has more legs than the idea of a anime RPG, or even a TTRPG, even the whole JRPG and TTRPG form, because that's such a wide net.
Yep. It's more a descriptor of a, not even really a style, but like a medium. It's like saying you're making a comic book RPG or a video game RPG.
Mm-hmm.
If you can refine it down, specify it, give it a concrete flair and some design principles, absolutely it can work.
Yeah.
If you want to have a rom-com kind of wild comedy like Teenagers from Outer Space, that can work. But saying you're making an anime RPG is just... What do you mean by that?
And I think it's telling that you don't see that as much.
Yeah. You're not seeing the Big Eye Small Mouth anymore.
Uh, Big
No
Eye
offense
Small
on that.
Mouth is still around, but
Yeah, it is.
they're I think the only other major holdout in that style for the longest time was open versatile anime, but nobody's been able to find Wise Turtle for years, and
Yeah.
so I don't know what's going on with that.
Yep.
I've seen some people say that Valor leans into that, but Valor is very much skewed towards a shonen battle manga style of fantasy. You
Yeah.
know, because the creator behind it had previously done the Bleach D20 fan project.
Okay.
Uh, and I've had them on the show in the past, and
Really?
while because of the way it works, it can be adapted into certain settings. Like I've seen people adapt it uh, into Megaten or into the the Cold Steel part of the Trails universe. Um, it does have a particular vibe that it's trying to go for.
Yeah.
Um, and I know where this kind of thing gets even more interesting is looking at it in contrast with the TTRPG scene in Japan. Is the idea of like a one size fits all generic fantasy kind of game? I haven't seen a whole lot of that.
Yeah.
Um, I've talked a lot about Sword World, and that has a setting. It has a setting, and that setting has its own set of lore. Or you've got stuff like Convictor Drive, which a lot of people during its run were saying that it was the Kamen Rider RPG, but but it's not trying to be the whole of Kamen Rider. Thank God, you're dealing with like 50 years of history doing that.
Yep.
Like people thought people thought me doing a Final Fantasy RPG was me casting a wide net. Oh, imagine, and that's just with like 30 or so years. Imagine doing that for 50. but but instead, it is more focused on the more tech-based type of Tokusatsu heroes, especially Kamen Rider Fies, and I think the designer has also hinted that Iron Man was a big influence.
Hmm.
Which, given that there's the implication that your hero form is essentially power armor, I could see it. Maybe the influence came from the '90s cartoon.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, the one that gave us the Iron Man briefcase,
Fair.
which was why Iron Man 2 had to reference that.
Really? Yeah. I was unaware,
Mhm.
but hey, more you know.
Yeah, but when it comes, I think that's also the reason why it's so hard to get things started when it comes to a superhero entry, because a lot of them are still doing that whole broad brush approach, that kitchen sink approach.
Yep.
One of the rare exceptions, I think, was Masks, which was skewing more towards the young hero archetype. You know, your Teen Titans, your Young Justice, your X-Men sometimes, that kind of thing.
It absolutely had a focus on the balance between superhero and being a teenager or having drama.
Mm-hmm.
And it very much cooked that into the system, into the theming. It was very explicit about this is not just superheroes, this is superheroes with melodrama and probably teenagers.
Yeah. You don't see as many overall mecha type of RPGs. Instead, you end up seeing ones that have a particular direction.
Yep.
I'd say we mentioned Lancer earlier. Lancer very much has its mud and lasers kind of setting.
Yep.
Stuff like Battle Century G is, well, because of where it started, it's drawing heavily upon the Super Robot Wars series of games. But there is one, when it comes to doing this sort of adapting, there is one pitfall you can fall in that I've seen. And that is taking the wrong angle with what you're adapting. Because I know I'm in the minority with this, but I did not care for Avatar Legends.
All right.
And
How so?
This will sound a bit odd when I phrase it, but there's a method to the madness. Avatar Legends was more focused on adapting the TV show and not the world the TV show takes place in.
Interesting. All right. So, were there any particular parts of the system that you think really contributed to that, or because from all the impressions I've gotten, it seemed like they were very much trying to make this is not just the TV show, this is any era you want, any part of the world, but
now one part of it is the fact that that some of the ads were talking about playing alongside characters from the series.
Yeah.
A big part of it was their reasoning as to why they did not allow for playable avatars. Their argument being some things should remain mysterious. Which I have a hard time buying, because ultimately you're leaving storytelling opportunities on the table for people to create their own avatar arc. The book did not give a whole lot of guidance in terms of going off the beaten path of canon, like going with what if scenarios and the like.
Yeah.
Which even something as lore dense as, say, Legend of the Five Rings has done multiple times, in fact.
Yeah.
There was also the fact that for some reason it tried to do this weird approach to doing a class system, and having the idea of benders as classes instead of using playbooks. You know, since it's built on the Power by the Apocalypse framework, you'd think that they'd go with some sort of playbook-like design. But the fact that you couldn't be a firebender who also utilized some sort of melee weapon expertise was a separate quote-unquote class along with machinery.
Yeah.
Which means that two of the builds that you see in the actual TV show you couldn't do.
Yeah. They took the archetypes that people would recognize from the TV show's plot and separated them into distinct playbooks rather than letting people flow freely and mix between them for new ideas. Like, I think you could absolutely have a firebender who does machines, like you said, it showed up in the show, but
well, that and consider Zuko's big style for a good chunk of the series was firebending along with his dual sabers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or Aang with the glider staff, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's the fact that it's from the way things were written out, it wanted so badly to have people play in the sandbox of the canon universe rather than using that as a sandbox for people to go in their own direction. This can result in continuity lockout.
Yeah. If you go to bossing, say, what time period are you going in? Because that's going to restrict the kind of adventures and stuff you can do.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Like, I, at some point, want to do a version of the Earth Kingdom that is essentially going through its own version of World War I. You know, where the different individual kingdoms are in one giant clusterfuck against each other.
Yeah. Kind of a Three Kingdoms style battle royale of political and military maneuvering.
Yeah. Basically, the Earth King is dead, and everybody's pointing fingers as to who did it. And alliances of, okay, if you go to war with it, with if you go to war, then I go to war with you. Start getting pulled.
That could be very interesting to see.
'Cause-
Because a lot of the Earth Kingdom's themes in the show are all about unity, and they have this big, strong figurehead.
Mhm.
And then, you see all the political maneuvering underneath. But when you don't have that, you have a splintered kingdom.
Yeah. Because the big reason I brought up World War One in that sense is I did do an alternate history campaign a long time ago of what if Franz Ferdinand wasn't assassinated? Because so that is considered the tipping point that kicked off World War One. But if I'm being honest, World War One was going to happen regardless. It was just a matter of what was going to set it off.
Yeah.
Because Europe was a powder keg, politically.
Absolutely.
The biggest part of that powder keg was the fact that there were essentially 11 nations that made up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Only 2 of them had any real political power. Ferdinand actually was trying to reform that. He wanted to turn it into an empire, into a United States of Austria-Hungary.
Yeah.
Which makes his assassination all the more ironic.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of the nations involved and a lot of the factions involved had that same idea of, okay, if you go to war, I go to war with you, which is what caused such a mess.
Yeah. And I mean, you throw in that whole political maneuvering along with the recent ideas of nationalism blooming, the various revolutions that a lot of countries were still settling down from, like the revolutions of 1848, and the Balkan War, which showed off just exactly how a bunch of big empires conflicting with each other could look to everyone, and the gains and losses that come with it.
Like the idea of one particular fantasy that I've always wanted to explore in both tabletop and in video games is the idea of you being an on-the-ground ruler of some area. Not in the sense of ruling a faction like in a 4X game like Civilization, but being on the ground and having to do it.
Yeah, kind of a kingmaker style thing where you are both the person going out and the person ruling back home.
Yes. Especially if being caught in that sort of political powder keg is one approach to make it all the more interesting.
Yeah.
But I will note another game I can think of that fell into that whole focusing on the wrong thing with adaptation was the Power Rangers RPG, and that one actually managed to get me angry.
Ooh, yeah, no, I'm with you there.
Because, and this again is tying into the way something is advertised. It outright says, this is the only book you need to run a Power Rangers themed campaign. And yet, I'd say about 90% of the book skews towards the Zordon area in general, and Season 1 MMPR in particular.
Yeah.
Now, we have had multiple eras. We've had the Disney era, we've had the Neil Saban era, we had the short-lived Hasbro era, because Hasbro can't stop getting in their own damn way. And that's not even getting into the various ups and downs of Super Sentai going all the way back to the 70s.
Yep.
And all of that you have to account for. And I understand not wanting to not wanting to do everything at once and all of that. But as the saying goes, don't piss on my head and tell me it's raining. Especially since that's not even considering if somebody wants to veer off into their own direction with the idea of doing Power Rangers and tabletop, which will happen. We've seen it in fan art all over the place.
Yep.
But I remember looking at the staff for it, and I saw that a lot of people behind it had only done like adventures for 5e, and I'm like, maybe you should have just made a 5e Power Rangers module. You'd probably be in your wheelhouse instead of a whole new system.
Yeah. And from what I understand, that system wasn't even very unique on its own. It still took a lot of different stuff and didn't do much of it particularly well.
I do remember one of the big problems I had was the idea of how they handled the idea of Ranger colors as classes, treating them as 20-level character classes. And the problem is the way those were designed was very much skewed towards Season 1 MMPR. You know, of things like the blue being the smart guy. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Power Rangers and with Super Sentai, but not every blue is the smart guy.
Yeah, no. I've seen the meme of, you know, how's the blue one unique? I'm Scottish.
Yeah.
It's yeah. Boil it down, but yeah, the colors are not always united in what they represent or even how they're played out.
Mm-hmm. There are recurring personality archetypes for certain, but it's not always consistent with the colors, especially since some colors don't appear as consistently as others.
Yep.
I know that there was that one dumbass producer at Toei who argued that yellow was a female color, and except that's only happened maybe twice, 3 times over the years.
Yep.
I do think that if they had built it around personality archetypes, that might have been better, but one of the other problems was some of the class designs very much assumed certain weapons.
Yeah.
Like it assumed that if you're doing pink, you're using a ranged weapon.
Yeah.
And
ultimately, sorry, go on.
That's not an assumption you should be making in that kind of sandbox approach.
Yeah. I think that I may not speak for everyone, but when you go to play a Power Rangers game, you're not necessarily looking to recreate Mighty Morphin. I think very few people go in with that kind of expectation. They want to do their own thing. I've seen a couple. Let's.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Sorry to cut off, but I do want to bring up that you're not in the minority with that.
Yeah.
A long time ago, there was a Indiana Jones game made by TSR that assumed people would only want to play as the cast from the movies.
Yeah.
Not only did it bomb, it was a critical disaster. They got roasted over the coals, and nobody tried Indiana Jones again until a few years later, when West End Games did it for their Masterbook series with the World of Indiana Jones. Didn't make the same mistake and got a much better result.
Yeah. There's that remnant of game design from that era. Not necessarily that era, but with the idea of when you make a franchise game, you assume that, for some reason they assume that, oh, people want to play in here because they like these characters specifically and no other part of the world. No, people didn't go into the Power Rangers RPG wanting to play specifically Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, but the GM can do some new monsters or whatever. They wanted to do their own series.
Mm-hmm. There wasn't even a monster creator system in the core book, which is just criminal.
Yeah, which just even makes it even worse.
Mm-hmm.
And I had seen a couple. This is a little something, but I've seen a couple other actual plays online way before that game came out. Even they had an officially sponsored actual play series.
Yeah, Hyperforce, I saw that.
Yeah, absolutely. There was another one done by the podcast that since has gone defunct, Terrible Warriors.
Mm-hmm.
They had a zombie apocalypse themed Power Rangers game, which was a hugely interesting take on it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think people went in wanting that, but they made that anyways. And they could have done it as, oh, you have the archetype, but it's not tied to the color. All they had to do was remove the color coding, make it a little bit more versatile, and make a better game. But
Yeah, the problem is you think everyone thinks it's just make a few changes, but then those changes end up linking into more changes, and it's just the snowball rolling down the hill.
yeah,
Um,
all they had to do was just remove these terms here, change this here, and make a whole new game.
yeah. Oh, I've seen some people want to make attempts to do more grid combat design with Legend Edition. They think about it for like a day and then they stop because they realize the amount of work that it would take to do that.
Yeah.
Because so much of how I designed it was built around its row-based combat system. Front row and back row for the PC and NPC sides.
Yeah.
And if you change that, it ends up cascading into everything else.
Yeah. I mean, like, Exalted Essence simplified the range system down to where there's just 5 different range bands where, hey, how close am I in relation to that thing in particular?
Mm-hmm.
You could be in intimate range with an enemy, but close range to another one. It was all relative distancing. But it's kind of hard to adapt that into a grid-based setting when you don't have definitive numbers and vague descriptions.
Yeah, and Exalted Essence was slightly better, but it still has that same problem of still missing the point.
Yeah.
I do feel if somebody wants something that is in the direction of Exalted but doesn't have but is a little bit better designed, I always recommend to them Godbound.
Yeah, I can see that.
In fact, I know that one podcast that I did listen to quite a bit had basically converted their stuff from Exalted into Godbound, and it more or less worked.
Yeah.
Godbound is done by the same guy who did the Without Number series of games, and he is a mad genius.
Yeah.
It started out with Stars Without Number, which managed to be a very modular space opera spin on BX.
Yeah.
And then expanding it with different genres. Worlds Without Number was a fantasy spin on the concept. Then Cities Without Number was a cyberpunk expand of the concept. He's working on Ashes Without Number, which is a post-apocalyptic version of the concept. But each of them is a very modular approach, and he usually puts out a simplified version for free, but the more modular aspects he puts in the deluxe version. Which I'd say is an interesting way to get people into a given game.
Yeah.
Essentially a gimped version of the rules, but for free, and the full rules are in the paid version.
Yeah. In SRD, that shows you. Sorry, go on.
I remember the Tibet RPG did a similar thing where it had the full rules, but character creation, you could only play different types of monks. But truth be, I do see William Silva on the YouTube end of the comments saying I could see a Power Rangers RPG based on the Street Fighter RPG. I like the Street Fighter RPG, but no.
Yeah.
I do think that the project that his unfortunate name being Mr. Wright is he's already adapting his fifth engine thing, which is kind of a fusion of elements between D&D 5e and Fate, but very heavily leaning towards Fate with a little bit of 5e in there. Although he's not using fudge dice, he's using die sizes a la Savage Worlds.
Okay.
I think any sort of system that has a degree of granularity or the like, I don't think can work with something like tokusatsu. I think you need some. I think the systems that can work are the ones that are more abstract. Um,
Yeah.
I will admit something like Magi Knight's Awakening, which I've covered extensively on the channel, is an exception, but that was originally a Genesis project that got converted to 5e, but its current incarnation barely it uses some of the DNA of 5e, but it's not cross-compatible.
Yeah.
Which I have a feeling we're going to see more of that, of games that use the skeleton of 5e but aren't meant to be 5e compatible.
Yeah.
And
Ultimately, I think that breaking away from 5e is going to be a big... It's going to be a process, but we are seeing a lot of stuff that is starting to branch out way more and be more bold with taking the spirit, but not the granular systems.
we are seeing that, and I feel like that was inevitable, but the OGL fiasco from a couple years ago accelerated things.
Absolutely.
And because of the amount of people I've talked to over the years on this channel, and some of them have done third-party stuff for D&D, I was in an awkward position during that whole thing, because I had some people asking me how much I knew about the situation, which I didn't know much. And I was talking with a bunch of people who had more legal backgrounds about whether or not this could set a bad precedent in the future. Of course, though I do find it a amusing bit of timing that Wizards of the Coast backed off on that whole messing with the OGL right around the time that they were getting shit talked by one of their investors on social media.
Yep. Yeah. Ultimately, I like to think that the popular outcry around the OGL did genuinely make it end. But ultimately, when it comes to any corporation, money is going to be a bigger factor than the people talking about it on social media, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, there was certainly that, but I think the other thing was Paizo, their biggest competitor, saying, "Screw you, we're going to make our own license."
Yeah.
And we're going to contact the people you contacted 20 years ago to help us do it.
Yeah, no.
And because of the fact that that license is in a spot in the Library of Congress, that same kind of fuckery can't happen again.
Yep.
That of course being the Orc license, which the thing about the OGL is that it was intended to be a peace offering after the vexatious litigation that TSR did in their waning years. Because they were going after anybody who was putting up house rules on the internet.
Yep.
To the point where they were spending more money on their lawyers than their actual games. Which was one of the many factors that led to TSR going bankrupt. But with this particular move, the big reason why it was such a shitstorm was you have thousands upon thousands of books that have that OGL in there, with a understood agreement that there would be a degree of protection from any sort of legal shenanigans for using terms that are in the D20 system. It wasn't a binding contract, but it was an understood agreement. And there was the question of, does that mean a lot of the companies who made stuff under the OGL were going to get sued retroactively? And I do remember the day before they backed off, I was watching a clip from a podcast that had said that this could cause a bad precedent when it comes to open licenses with software. Which, of course, then a couple days after that, the announcement comes of, oh, we're taking the OGL and we're putting it in the Creative Commons license. Which... But when you mentioned that money talks when it comes to this sort of thing, well, let's consider how Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast have been doing over the last 3 years.
Oh, absolutely.
Hasbro's stock has been in a slow bleed free fall. Also, hi there, Chris. I see you in the chat.
Howdy.
You know, Honor Among Thieves was supposed to be their big ticket into bringing D&D onto the silver screen. That ended up doing worse than Shazam 2. And Shazam 2 wasn't exactly a world beater.
Oh my god. I had heard nothing but good things about it, but heard, commercially underperformed.
It wasn't a bad movie per se, but it chose the worst time to come out. It came out a week after John Wick Chapter 4, and a couple weeks before Super Mario Brothers.
Oof, yeah, no.
Between those juggernauts, it had no chance.
Yeah.
It really should have come out I know it's, say, Dumping Ground month, but it really should have come out in August.
Yeah.
Where it would have had less competition, because either August or maybe January, where a lot of studios aren't putting out the big heavy hitters. On the Transformers side of things, there was a genuine hit with Transformers 1 that was undercut by underperforming due to a shitty marketing decision.
An unfortunately common circumstance with a lot of movies nowadays.
Yeah, and the marketing made Transformers 1 seem like it was going to be a more jokey, almost Whedonism-laden movie, and it isn't.
Yeah. A lot of movies have leaned into that, with playing out the quips in the trailers and putting up all the bright, colorful imagery.
Mm-hmm. And I think I've said for the longest time that the better way to market is not to do the whole screening for critics thing, but appeal to the YouTubers. Appeal to the YouTubers, appeal to the streamers, and so on. It's worked wonders when it comes to video games.
Yeah.
Like, I've argued that streamers are a better advertisement for a lot of games than buying ad space is.
Yeah. Ultimately, you got to consider what your demographic is looking at rather than what traditionally you advertise things on.
Tradition is sweet poison.
Yeah. If you looked at like the 90s and 80s and whatnot with Nintendo Power, magazines, advertisements, and comic books, those were the things that gamers were looking at. Especially when, they built it into the brand of the magazine. But nowadays, gamers aren't looking at billboards and TV screens for their next video game ads and information on games.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking at news sites. They're looking to their streamers. They're looking to YouTubers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, hell, this even applies to a lot of like nostalgic franchises like Transformers, G.I. Joe, Power Rangers. If your demographic is generally older, you want to go for more online sources. And I mean, hell, you market something enough online, it can get popular even without people liking it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I look at, the certain Shadow Legend.
Yeah. So I don't see that as aggressively as I did a couple of years ago, or even a year ago.
Absolutely. But the fact that it became a meme with how aggressively it was advertised without nobody knowing what it actually entailed, I think showed the power of the marketing, and it's still making tons of profits today.
Yeah, but on the Magic the Gathering end of things, a lot of people didn't point this out during the OGL fiasco, but just before that whole thing went down, Hasbro was getting raked over the coals, not by fucking Bloomberg for overproducing Magic cards. Now, of course, we didn't realize that at the time that Hasbro would do something as stupid as calling in the fucking Pinkertons.
Jesus, that was such a marketing move, but in the worst possible way. Because then it got people studying the Pinkertons.
I remember when I
They
found
gave,
that, I was like, wait, the Pinkertons are still around? I haven't heard about them since I was in middle school.
yeah, you would think of them like the last time I heard about the Pinkertons was in Red Dead Redemption. They're still a thing.
Mm-hmm.
They're real, but then you hear they used it to break down on a streamer who accidentally got some card packs he wasn't supposed to.
Which,
Rather than the place where a politely worded email probably would have worked.
yeah. Are you familiar with a YouTuber called Armchair Expert?
I am not. Do tell.
He has a media and PR background. I first found out about him when he broke down the whole shitstorm with Niji Sanji and Selen, now Doki Bird, from a PR perspective. And the thing that they pointed out is, there is obviously a bit of common sense applies, but in some cases, clear communication will always be the better solution as opposed to a heavy-handed approach.
Yep.
He also remarked that, ironically, PR has a PR problem. In the sense that when PR is doing what it's supposed to, you don't know it's there.
Yeah.
You know it's there when somebody fucks up.
Yeah.
And
PR. Sorry, go on, but
and a lot of the stuff that was going on there was definitely in that camp. There's also the fact that right around the time that they were doing all of those things, they were trying to build up to that 2024 now, which is still not completely out, version of the core rule books. I think some.
Yep.
And I remember looking at the covers and getting confused because they had the brilliant idea of having characters from the old 80s cartoon on the covers, and some people were like, "Oh, that's cool, doing a nice throwback," and I'm like, "Why?"
Yeah.
A lot of the 5e crowd didn't grow up with that cartoon. They're going to be like, "Who are these people?" They're not going to be able to relate. And the people who are able to relate, you ran them off.
Yeah. If they did that as a variant cover, it would be cute, but like, I didn't even know that the 80s cartoons characters were on the 2024 cover.
Mm-hmm.
I just learned about that right now.
Yeah. And every few days I end up hearing about some controversy about some change that they're making for the sake of politics or for reasons I don't fully understand. I remember when they were still doing playtesting and they turned the Warlock into another half-caster in the name of giving it more opportunities to use magic. And I was like, you completely missed the point of why people pick Warlock.
Yeah.
There's already plenty of half-casters as is.
Yeah.
And I think that, doing things like changing the approach with orcs, changing the approach with druids, which again would be perfectly fine if you're actually building a setting, but you're still playing half seats.
Yeah. In general, I think that sorry, go on. So
essentially. And there's been some attempts to do merch, but I think one of the biggest damning points when it comes to the state of things of Wizards of the Coast is that the distribution deal to get D&D books in places like Target and Walmart and all that went kaput a little over a year ago. The sweet irony is, back in the day, Lorraine Williams, when she was running TSR, unfortunately, because nobody I know who's ever worked at TSR has nice things to say about her, and people who were around at the time certainly don't. Nobody likes her. Was trying to get D&D into Sears catalogs, even though everybody was telling her that's a bad idea.
Yeah.
Basically, she was trying to get D&D out of the hobby stores and into Sears catalogs are into full-on department stores.
Yeah.
Which is a case of the grass may be greener on the other side, but it's only green because of the radiation. So they may have stopped the bleeding when it came to backing off on the whole OGL thing, but it is a case of too little too late, because in the aftermath of that, a lot of people went, if it was that easy for you to fuck me, what's stopping you from doing it twice?
Yeah.
And as a result, they've started to make they've started either making their own games, or they have made the same game but renamed everything that could be associated with the OGL.
Yep. I mean, for Pathfinder, for them it was just pretty much an errata update, just changing a lot of the names. That was pretty much all they need to do.
Changing all of the names to fit the now Orc license instead of the OGL.
Yep.
And pulling a big dick move by saying all of the changes that we're doing here, they're going to be completely free on the Archives of Nethys wiki.
I will always say that officially collaborating with Archives of Nethys is one of the best things Paizo can do. Because if anyone knows, the only thing I wish is that they had it as I wouldn't say a supported product, but they made it more open. They publicized the correspondence more.
Yeah. But the point is that having that place as the official unofficial Pathfinder rules reference, makes things easier for people when they need to look up something very specific in a given book.
Yep.
I know some people will bring up D&D Beyond when it comes to this, but if I'm being honest, D&D Beyond lost my interest due to how it handles its homebrew aspect. The fact that you can't make whole new classes, for instance, was a deal breaker.
Yeah.
You can make subclasses, but not full classes. And there was that screenshot of a D&D Beyond Plus that made the rounds that people claimed was fake, but given that about 5 years ago, I remember rumblings about Wizard of the Coast wanting to implement live service elements, was the wording in one of the releases. It's a case where I can't really write it off.
Yeah. And I mean, they are allegedly still working on making an official virtual tabletop for
that thing's gonna flop.
Oh, absolutely. Especially, I mean, for example, I use Foundry quite a bit, and they've, I believe, started releasing official system modules for that.
Yeah, putting aside the conflict of interest part, there's two reasons I've been insistent that thing is going to flop. One of them is, if you look at most virtual tabletops, they do not go the 3D route. There are ones that do, but they're in the minority, like say Tailspire.
Mm-hmm.
Tailspire, RPG Bard. Those are the only two main ones I can think of that do a 3D virtual tabletop.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you can run campaigns on Tabletop Simulator, but I don't count that for the purposes of this.
Yeah, Tabletop Sim is the exception. It's not. Yeah.
But the big reason for that is accessibility. The big reason you don't see as many 3D ones is messing around with making custom 3D models is harder than making custom 2D stuff. And even more so because somebody brilliantly decided we're going to use the Unreal Engine for this, which is going to narrow things down further, because now you need people who, if they want to do homebrew stuff in your thing, they have to know how the Unreal Engine works. So that's going to bottleneck it further.
Yeah.
And apparently, the reason why they went with the Unreal Engine is so that they could put it on consoles.
Fucking actually? I think that...
To quote a line from The Hangover, you are literally too stupid to insult.
Yeah. I think that as soon as you said Unreal Engine, I'm like, people aren't going to be, depending on how complex they get with it, that's going to be a usability issue for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that a lot of VTTs run into just normally is a lot of players sometimes are people who don't have consoles or desktop computers. They have lower spec machines. I don't know if this is a major concern for a lot of people, but like being able to run Roll20 can take a pretty good browser or is near impossible on mobile.
It
So,
can be done
I
on
have a
mobile,
couple-
but you need it. You need but you can theoretically do a, because it's mostly cloud based. It's more about your connection than your hardware. You can run Roll20 on a potato.
Yeah. But like that's fair. But I don't know if this is just me, but I have a lot of players who, again, this is probably a minority, but who got into TTRPGs because they don't have access to a lot of like high-end video gaming equipment, so they take it up as an alternative to that. So saying, "Oh, let's use a virtual tabletop this time," and then making it such that you just can't run it on a lower end machine.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to overheat the shitty old Windows XP laptop they use for everything else. And Unreal Engine 3D rendering is going to kill that. Again, it's probably not even on their concerns, but I think that's a factor that should be considered.
Here's another factor.
Yeah.
The VTT market is very, very competitive these days. Between obviously Roll20 is the big one, but you have Foundry, you have Fantasy Grounds, you have more bare bones stuff like Owlbear Rodeo. You have stuff that's built for 5e specifically, like Shard Tabletop. You have some of the prettier stuff like Alchemy.
Yeah.
All of these are very feature-rich affairs. That is the baseline that you have to meet now.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't meet that baseline, then it's worse than doing nothing at all. And I am not confident that it can meet that baseline. Oddly enough, I ended up saying a similar thing when Diablo 4 came around, because I was not optimistic about its chances with how competitive the ARPG market is these days.
A wise prediction.
And in fact, I had said at the time, Diablo 4 is a great advertisement for other ARPGs. And then a week later, Titan Quest 2 gets announced.
Ooh, and don't forget Path of Exile too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which I knew was on the way. That I think that just made things go even further. But there were a bunch of high quality ARPGs when Diablo 4 came out, and I'm like, you've got the name, yeah, but I'm not sure if that's going to be enough unless you really hit it out of the park.
Yep.
And they did. I still haven't heard hide nor hair about that. There was talk about a Diablo board game and TTRPG a few years ago, but I haven't heard any updates on that. I don't even know if that's still in the works.
Yeah.
It would be funny if it did happen, because there were some old D&D modules that were based on Diablo. But
let's see. Sorry, I'm looking it up right now. Hope you don't mind.
Yeah, I know that the team who was supposed to be working on it was also working on a few other video game to board game adaptations. And I guess one of those may have taken precedent.
Yeah. Looking at them, Glass Cannon Unplugged. It looks like the Diablo board game role-playing game is in the works. But they also have Frostpunk the board game, which is out.
Mm-hmm.
Apex Legends Dying Light, and a Don't Starve board game Kickstarter. That's a lot of big name properties, but yeah. And speaking of that, sorry to divert for just a second. There was a Dark Souls tabletop game that came out, and that's just completely dropped off the map for me.
Yeah, because as somebody who went through it, it was shit. And apparently the team that did it got fired.
Holy shit.
At least that's the rumor that I heard. Because
Yeah.
for starters, using 5e, it would not be my first choice personally, but okay, I will let you cook. But they ended up creating problems that didn't even need to exist.
Yep.
The big one was... Because you've played at least one Souls-like in your life, yes?
Oh, absolutely.
So you know the relation...
I'm not a Luddite. Yeah.
So you know how stamina works. For
Yeah.
some ungodly reason, they decided to combine health and stamina into one thing called position.
That's not a thing. That's not a Souls-like thing. What?
As a means to try and reinforce the risk reward aspects, but the problem is that that's going to result in a lot of turtling. And while Dark Souls has had issues with turtles in the past, not to this level.
Yeah.
And really, that turtling problem kind of went by the wayside by the time we got to Dark Souls 3.
Yeah.
But using a I know some people, I've seen some people go, but you make a class when you pick a class when you do your character in Dark Souls. That's a starting package. That's not a class.
Yeah, no.
Dark
if anything, it's more like a background in 5e.
Yeah, and even that's I can see that because of the whole starting kit with backgrounds, but even that's kind of a stretch.
Yeah, they have more mechanical impact than backgrounds in 5e.
And still using the Vancian model when it came to spellcasting in that 5e Dark Souls project, which, if someone had put that to me, I would have said, let's not do that. Let's just go with an MP setup and just have attunement slots, like what people would expect. There's no reason to try and force that into the Vancian model when you're dealing with that kind of model just isn't going to work, because the source material that we're building around isn't designed for it.
Yeah. I think that's what, I don't know, this might just be me, but a lot of 5e supplements fall into that trap, where 5e is a system built with specific principles and specific systems in mind, but then they don't want to branch out too far from basic 5e, so the details of the setting or the franchise they're emulating get lost in the sauce of 5e.
Yeah. There's also the issue of how are you going to handle races, because, you're not exactly picking a race when you play a Souls-like.
Yeah.
I've seen some people go into, okay, what system would have worked, or maybe an earlier version of D&D would have worked, and like none of those would have worked. Trying to do going over which systems would have worked is kind of forced for the trees. The important thing is, instead of trying to bring a TTRPG system into Dark Souls, you should be doing the reverse.
Yeah.
I
will say, sorry to interrupt, but I think if there was one that I would be willing to try and modify for Dark Souls, because ultimately the Souls-like genre in itself has a lot of unique trappings in terms of gameplay, let alone the lore of the specific entries. I don't know, but Pathfinder 2nd Edition, with its focus on tactical combat and specifically the action economy as a whole, I could see working with it to create something like, if you want to gain defense bonuses, you have to spend an action for that. Something like, instead of stepping, it's called dodge rolling, and it gives you a, more defensive finesse, I guess. Something like that.
I'm not
Again,
sure.
It's a stretch. Yeah.
I think part of the problem in doing like Pathfinder 2nd Edition is the fact that still is a class-based system.
Yeah, but with the dedication system, you could have more of a focus on things like, you have a basic class, but then you move on and you might pick up a certain sword style, or you might learn how to do miracles or pyromancy.
The other problem is the way Pathfinder handles feet. It's a very good setup, but I don't think it would be compatible with how open Dark Souls wants to be with its setup. The system I have considered using as a base, if I wanted to do Souls-like in that form, is something akin to how Sword World works. Because Sword World has a class system, but not in the sense that people might think. You're not gaining XP and then leveling up the class that you picked at character creation. You are spending XP on classes, which are more akin to skill packages.
Yeah. Which definitely does fit more in line with the Souls-like, I guess, thematics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
The approach I would just take instead is you're spending XP directly on the core six attributes. I'd also say that there was a free game from several years back that if you hacked it to hell, it could work as a foundation, and that is the Worm Engine, or Warrior, Rogue, and Mage, which had it that Warrior, Rogue, and Mage weren't your classes per se, but rather your core attributes.
Interesting.
In a way that when it came out, a lot of people were being reminded of Fable. Which, if you're reminded of Fable 1, that's fine. If you're reminded after any Fable after 1, there's issues.
Yeah.
But I think it's telling that after that... Now, I don't know for... The thing about whether or not the team that did the Dark Souls 5e got sacked, that's on the rumor mill, so take that with a grain of salt. But what I think is even more telling is what their next project was. An Elden Ring board game. After that, they went straight back to doing board games and doing miniatures for 5e Encounters through their Epic Encounters series.
Yep.
What that tells me is that they decided to go, this isn't working, let's stick to what we know. Because the Dark Souls board game is very good. And I'd imagine if that's just gonna be refined for the Elden Ring board game, it'll do well.
Yeah.
But I do know that a friend of mine, Ed Jowett, is trying to work on a project called Soul Mist, which is gonna be taking his D10 based era system and adapting that into Souls. But he is doing an approach to stamina and using it as almost like a hand of cards. I'm vastly simplifying, but his approach is very... It is trying to emulate the spirit of that stamina approach rather than the letter. And he doesn't use classes in his game anyways, so he's got a leg up.
Yeah. If I may, there is a unofficial Souls-like TTRPG that had, I don't want to say a similar kind of approach, but something in the same vein, where you would roll a set of dice at the beginning of each round, and that would determine what level of actions you could take by spending the individual dice. So, I don't know how exactly comparable that would be to his system, but ultimately the idea of stamina as a expendable resource used in certain ways in combat seems to be a kind of common ground.
Yeah, it's when you're doing these sort of adaptations, there's a degree of granularity that you have to parse, and I do think it can be done with the right approach. But I do think Fortunately, there's been a whole host of games that may not have the name, but are definitely carrying the spirit of Souls-like and are doing a lot better job. Uh, I've seen some use this to say, well, it just means that if you have the official name of the IP, then it's automatically going to suck. Except you can make that argument with like video games, but not with TTRPGs. There's been way too many IP adaptation TTRPGs over the years that have been highly regarded and been successful, even after their print runs have come and gone. I'd say two of the big examples are the various RPGs for Star Trek and Star Wars.
Yeah, I think that those ones have had a variety of different systems throughout their history that have given them a bit more staying power than if they just tried it once and then never did it again. Especially for franchises with such popular appeal to a lot of different people.
Oh yeah. And because I did a whole thing a while back covering various Star Wars RPGs. Some of them better than others, but in that same vein, there's been a bunch of well-regarded Marvel and DC ones. DC Heroes is still highly regarded by a large amount of people. Same with Marvel TSR, also known as Marvel Phase Rip. And I know some people after the first RPG was announced were like, well, everything's getting an RPG these days, and I shot that down with, this is nothing new. Back in the day, there was a Dallas TTRPG.
Yep.
The only thing people mostly remember from Dallas is the Who Shot JR story. Mostly because that was parodied in The Simpsons.
Yeah.
Admittedly, it was a good parody because, there's a long list of people who would want to shoot Monty Burns.
Yep.
But the point is that there's right and wrong ways to do it, and it isn't that hard. It's just a matter of understanding what you're working with and the fact that you shouldn't be trying to force a square peg into a round hole.
Yep.
Which is why I'm a bit concerned for the Phantasy Star TTRPG in the works. Now, the team that's developing it, Alligator Alley Entertainment, they have done good stuff with the 5e framework in the past. And some of their previous stuff leans into that science fantasy approach, so they are the right people for that kind of job. But I think where my concern is that they're going to do things like try and put the spells per day model in a place that it doesn't belong.
Yeah.
Because there's also the fact that I think there's going to be a bit of a disconnect, a bit of a miscommunication issue, because it's very clear that the Phantasy Star that they're adapting is from the Genesis era. The Genesis/Master era. So basically the first 4 games. And in particular, Phantasy Star 2. 2, maybe 4. 3 is in the Hall of We Don't Talk About That. It's the black sheep of the quartet.
Alright.
But a lot of people, their exposure to Phantasy Star is the online games. So there may be a bit of disconnect.
Yeah.
Especially since the most of the people who are playing Phantasy Star now are playing online too.
Yeah.
So that is certainly a concern. I'm not saying that there's no market for this kind of thing, but I do think measuring expectations is something that should be considered.
Yeah.
I actually think Catalyst may have pulled a smart move regarding this, because when they announced that they were making a Voltron game, there's the big question of, okay, are we talking OG Voltron or Legendary Defender? And the answer was both. There's one They kickstarted 2 books, one for each.
Yeah. Sounds wise.
Uh, in the same vein, I think, and there's multiple ways to tackle that kind of problem, but ultimately you have to pick one. As we mentioned before with FF Legend, our approach is we're using the recurring mythos as a sandbox for people to take in their own directions. Along with the pillar setup, though it has resulted in a few folk misinterpreting certain aspects, especially regarding the job system, which you've probably seen a bit of at this point.
Oh yeah, I experimented a bit with character creation from what you have out so far. I personally really enjoyed. It's a take I haven't seen before, but the idea of, you know what? Could you describe it? Just for anybody who may be unfamiliar.
We only have 4. You have your class, which is essentially a chassis. It's mainly going to be there to determine your HP and MP development, how many trained skills you have, and your and the abilities that you use for physical and magical combat.
Yeah.
But you are picking 3 jobs that develop along 20 levels at a 3-level stagger on a fast, medium, and slow rate, 1 per each. But a lot of people are used to the idea of you pick 1 job and that's it. Where in this case, you're picking a combination. And because of the fact that they're used to the whole 1 job concept, there's been plenty of people who have looked at the individual jobs in a vacuum.
Yeah.
There was a bit of a back and forth in the server regarding whether or not the monk was overtuned compared to, say, the sword saint. But I don't think that's the case, because they are working on 2 different kinds of energies. The monk has a combat loop tied around chakra, and the sword saint is all about building up.
Yeah, you have the concentration mechanic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And there was a bit of a controversy with one person who seemed to have an issue with the fact that the paladin job does not also get white magic. And part of the reason I did that was I didn't want to step on the toes of the white mage, for one. And 2, I don't feel white mage is a strong enough the white magic part of paladin in some of the past games. I don't think that's as strong of an element of the paladin identity as cover is.
Yeah.
There's also the fact that because of the 3 job setup, each one has to be more focused on what it does.
Yeah. Each one has its own specific mechanical niche in the abilities that it learns. And all that combines to make your general kit as a character.
Yeah. The versatility comes from the combination, not from choosing some jobs in, say, more class-based systems are going to have a degree of versatility because of the fact that it's the primary job that you pick. The versatility in Legend Edition comes from the combination that you pick.
Yeah.
Also, Endorphinate Ninja, I see you in the comments. I haven't seen that trailer, and I have no interest. But
if you don't mind me asking, what trailer are they talking about?
The Shrek 5 movie, which I have no desire to see. I've not seen a Shrek movie since the 3rd.
Yeah.
But because of that setup, looking at an individual job is going to be a forest for the trees kind of thing. And are there certain jobs that are going to combo better with others? Yeah. my co-writer Zan and I have talked about how how we realized the Fencer and the Arcanist could be a particular annoying combination, and we kept it in anyways because it was funny. You know, the Arcanist is all about trying to get people to hit them so that they can pass along curses, and the Fencer is all about forcing people to focus on them.
Yeah. I mean, you build up taunt, you curse them for buying into it.
Mm-hmm.
That's a kid.
Yeah. And those sorts of
But
ways...
the versatile job system has been something I've had a lot of fun
Mm-hmm.
theorizing about.
Yeah.
For example, I have a friend who has had a theoretical Final Fantasy game in the works for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a character who was meant to be a kind of wild man dragoon, but also a bit of a lancer.
Mm-hmm.
So I picked up dragoon as his primary job. But then I also got samurai and sword saint, which was an interesting combo, but it plays into the idea of his general martial style.
Mm-hmm.
Full on martial, and then took up a little bit of trained parry, some polearm spec, and there we go.
Yeah.
Got the character.
And I will admit, one of the other things that I've seen some people struggle with is the fact that if you're playing Dragoon in this system, you don't necessarily have to use a polearm.
Yeah.
We did the whole tag-based weapon system in order to avoid falling into the trap of constantly pushing a boulder up a hill. Because some game, movie, TV show, anime, or whatnot is going to introduce a weapon that has the same kind of cool factor as when people first saw the Buster Sword back in 1997.
Yeah.
And they're going to want to bring it into their campaigns. But if we had a set weapon list, putting aside that would veer away from the whole mythos over setting thing, we'd have to constantly keep adding things or have people come up with it on their own completely blind.
Yeah.
But with a tag-based approach, it's all about interpretation.
Yep.
So if somebody wants to interpret it as a polearm, they can do that. If they want to interpret it as a different type of weapon, they can do that as well. I had insisted on putting in the sidebar about how you could use it to interpret different unarmed fighting styles.
Also very fair.
So you could
a lot of martial.
You could have a monk fighter combo who's just a stance dancer.
Yeah. I mean, hell, if you really wanted to, you could have a monk dragoon who focuses on drop kicks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, I've seen those kind of things. Admittedly, some of the jobs that are in there are ones that aren't in the games, but I wanted to fill a certain role.
Yeah.
I'd say the big one of the big examples is Dervish. There's no Dervish in any of the video games, but I wanted a speed berserker.
Yeah. As long as it plays into the mythos, like you said.
Mm-hmm. And Chocobo Knight, because why have we not had mounted combat with chocobos?
Yeah. Yeah.
We get teased with it in like cutscenes and the like, but why have we not had a jousting tournament with chocobos, for fuck's sake?
Yeah, no. That does seem like something that would be in like 14 or 6 or whatnot. Chocobo jousting would be a great minigame.
Mm-hmm. I distinctly recall saying I want to see a lance charge on chocobos, damn it. You know, like the old pike charge.
Yeah.
Or even just somebody using a cavalry saber.
Yeah.
Admittedly, the Magitech Knight almost got cut until I realized I could turn it into an armor master in opposition to the weapon master.
Yeah.
You know, thinking of it less as the big platforms that you saw in 6 and more of power armor. I will
Yeah.
admit part of that was wanting to do some of the power armor I saw in like Anthem, because even though Anthem as a game sucked, the the motif of what it was trying to do scratched a certain itch. And I know I'm not the only one, because there was a because Poison Potion Press made a 5e campaign setting called Eldritch Sands that basically had the classes as different types of power armor.
Ooh.
Not the 5e classes per se, it had its own classes that it did it with. And even had a custom character sheet to look like the HUD of a um, of like the heads-up display of a power armor.
That's a neat little touch.
Which I think the only time I've seen something close to that is Chris Perrin's Mecha TTRPG, which had its character sheet look like the inside of a mech cockpit. And there, and the idea of classes as power armor is something I've tooled around with. And then a game from France called Night, not France, Spain, called Night came around that basically outdid what I was going to do.
Damn it.
It's unfortunate, but I'll tip my hat to somebody getting it right and the fact that it recently crossed the language barrier, so I can play it without having to rely on Google Translate. I hinted at this when I talked about Japanese tabletop, but the international TTRPG space is amusing to me. Because in a lot of those spaces, D&D is not the dominant entry.
Yep.
Like in Japan, it hasn't been the dominant entry since the 80s.
Yep. Call of Cthulhu has been way more prevalent.
Yeah. I've seen some people make technical jokes as to why that is, but I think it has more to do with the fact that there is already a growing subculture around detective fiction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. Like in the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of light novels based around mystery and urban fantasy stuff.
Oh, it goes even further back. And one of the big contributors was the Young Detective Club that was built around the translation works of, I forget his real name, but his pen name at the time was Edogawa Ranpo, who made a name for himself by translating the works of Arthur Conan Doyle and Edgar Allan Poe into Japanese.
Yeah.
And he was doing that way back in the day.
Yeah.
Like you... And I did check. His real name was Taro Hirai.
Okay.
There was also the fact that there were mystery writers like Ruiko Kuroiwa, who was also big into doing that kind of translation work. But eventually he would just start writing his own not his own novels. And when I say he goes far back, I mean pre World War II is how far back he goes.
Hello.
Oh, I'm still here. And of course there was a prize for mystery writers named after him. And I think you muted. Are you still there, man?
Apologies if you're still talking. I can't hear you. Allow me to reconnect.
I can hear. Testing 1 2. The quick brown fox tipped over the lazy dog.
There we go. So sorry about that.
No worries. But the point is that the whole mystery subculture, I'd say dates back all the way back to like the 1920s. So there was a lot of history when it came to mystery fiction in Japan. And since Call of Cthulhu is built around investigators, that certainly helped. One of the I've talked. Go ahead.
Sorry, before we get back into Call of Cthulhu,
Mhm.
I do also want to point out a little fun fact. Columbo was absolutely huge in Japan, especially during the 70s and 80s. Finding out about that was a great experience, because apparently during Emperor Hirohito's trip to Japan, he visited, or trip to America, I should say, he personally wanted to visit with Peter Falk.
Yeah. Which
Unfortunately, go on. Sorry.
is certainly interesting, but it further reinforces that point.
Yeah.
That there was the better part of a century's worth of build-up around mystery fiction in Japanese pop culture. So a game like Call of Cthulhu becoming as popular as it did, to the point where there are Japan-exclusive expansions and replays and the like, is not too much of a shock. There's also the fact that companies like Chaosium and Fasa had a much better relationship with the Japanese publishers. As opposed to TSR, that's I've told the story in the past, but the translation of AD&D, just AD&D First Edition, was too long and expensive of a process, and they sat on their hands for a good amount. And by the time it finally came out, Tunnels and Trolls had come out in Japan, which was in the same vein, was not very miniature intensive, and only used D6s, which were easier to get, especially in the more rural parts of the country. That's why a lot of Japanese tabletop uses D6s. There's exceptions, obviously, and since we're bringing up Call of Cthulhu, which uses the basic role-playing system, that's obviously going to be an exception. But the point is, it's something that was handled. There's also the fact that here in the States, TTRPGs evolved from war games. That's well known. That didn't really happen in Japan. It was more out of the computer gaming scene.
That is an interesting observation. The roots that they came from were very different from the Napoleonic war games that Gygax and his various creations, not necessarily just Gygax, but the tabletop wargaming established the tabletop community here, but not so in other countries.
Yeah. Obviously, in a place like Japan, space is at a premium, so it'd be tricky to do some of the big pitched battles. But there was also the fact that one of the big things that helped TTRPGs in Japan was replays, which are kind of like an actual play in text form, just decades before actual plays would be a thing.
Yep. The replay community in Japan was vibrant, well-known, and such to the point where various media properties spawned out of the replays of personal tabletop games.
Obviously, everybody knows about Record of Lodoss War's relationship within that.
Yep.
You know, starting out in Comptique magazine and then expanding out from there. If TSR was willing to play ball, it would have been an official D&D campaign setting.
What a timeline that would have been.
But because it didn't, we ended up getting Sword World out of it, which was them taking some of the mechanics from the Grey Witch PC game and messing around with that. Because the TSR calls blew up. As far as why, there's never been a consistent answer. Some say TSR just didn't answer their calls. Some say there were language barrier issues. Honestly, it could have been any of them. But when it And when it comes to places like Germany, uh, there was an attempt to try and bring D&D into Germany, but the deal fell through, and the company that was doing it decided to make their own game, which would become The Dark Eye, which is pretty much the fantasy TTRPG in Germany. We have recently gotten translations of like the last 2 editions worth of it.
Interesting. Yeah.
Uh,
I think you brought that up earlier. I don't remember exactly in what context, but
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But there's also the fact that in obviously in Sweden you've got all the stuff that Free League has been putting out, as well as a few other companies, and one of the early pioneers is what's now known as Dragonbane, which was heavily spun off from the Fantasy World campaign setting for basic role playing. And I've argued that Dragonbane's core set has a better dollar value for what you're getting compared to the core set for 5e in terms of introducing people into the hobby. Because for starters, Dragonbane's core set is like $51. And within that you have the full rules, 6 pre-gens, a 10 adventure adventure path, a solo variant, a couple of maps, a campaign map, standees for all the relevant monsters used in the campaign path, and a few blank character sheets and a full set of dice.
Yeah, that's real bang for your buck compared to the starter sets we have.
You know, where the 2014 starter set is like $120, and it's just the core. It's just the 3 core books and a GM screen.
Yeah.
And the 2024 core book set is over $240.
Jesus Christ.
And that's just if you're getting it print. If you want it print and PDF, you're paying even more. If you want to know why people aren't getting the 5.5 edition, there you go. It's the fucking price.
Yeah. Especially for something that is like we could debate back and forth on this, but something that I would consider to be not even a separate edition. They acknowledge it's not, but it's yeah.
People have been affectionately calling it 5.5, which maybe it would have sold better if they did.
Yeah. That would have made it way more distinct than 2014 versus 2024.
Mm-hmm.
Which, yeah. And differentiating between the two systems can be hard for someone who doesn't know the intricacies of the classes and whatnot.
Yeah.
Because they can look very similar.
The other thing that's annoying with that is, with a lot of other companies, it's pretty much standard practice that if you buy the physical copy, you get the PDF copy as a free add-on. You're not paying extra for it.
Yeah. Especially if that price is so exorbitant, they're not losing any margins on giving you the PDF.
Mm-hmm.
Which, the PDF is practically free to distribute. Some exceptions included, but just...
Yeah. And let me double check to make sure that I have my numbers right. Okay, I was slightly off. If you want the core bundle for both the physical and digital copies of the core rulebook, it's $180. I don't know why I thought it was over 200. So maybe they dialed it back at some point. Yeah. And I'm getting this off of the official D&D site. But even so, $180 for physical and digital is too much.
Yeah. And considering that 5e is, the public-facing tabletop RPG at the moment, that is a big investment to make for the average consumer.
Especially for somebody just starting. Let's say somebody is a fan of Critical Role and wants to run D&D themselves. And they have to see that they have to get that and then a bunch of others, then minis and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Or
If you saw a AAA video game for that price, you wouldn't buy it.
well, look at
But
the whole thing with GTA 6 and how the idea that GTA 6 might be $100 and the gaming community is like, fuck that shit.
yeah, there's been a progressive protest as it's been ramping up to 70, and now it's kind of, wouldn't say it's ramping up to 80, but the $70 price hike was controversial enough when it started happening around the beginning of the PS5 era.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's just GTA 6. I would almost justify it, but there's already contention about it, and we haven't seen any gameplay yet.
Well,
Makes it a hard.
Yeah, that's the other thing. The fact that I think what is not helping matters is the fact that you're seeing pundits trying to push for it as a good move, or saying that they have to do it at that price, otherwise they're not going to be able to make any profit, or not be able to break even. Which I'm like, your GTA.
Yeah,
the last 2 games are still getting played, sold, and bought.
this is one of the few franchises where, unlike things like Diablo or Starfield, you can expect a certain amount of minimum wages unless you fuck up somehow even more catastrophically than those franchises.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is the one franchise where you can justify having it. This is the one. But
And
with all this money sunk in, we gotta wonder, how is it gonna be worth it?
yeah, and especially since something that we've been seeing in Hollywood is the flop buster of people spending way too much money on projects that do not demand that high of a budget. I think one of the examples I've been pointing to from last year was a rom-com called Fly Me to the Moon, which cost $100 million to make.
Holy shit. What kind of expenses do you have on filming a rom-com that justify that cost?
For a bit of context, when it comes, I don't. Maybe it was marketing, maybe it was actor salary, who knows? But no rom-com has grossed that amount. The highest grossing rom-com was The Mermaid, and that only got about 90 million.
Huh.
And a rule of thumb to keep in mind when it comes to looking at this sort of things is that for a film to break even, it should make 2.5 times its budget. Its stated budget. Sometimes the stated budget isn't what they actually paid.
Yeah. And according to Wikipedia, the box office didn't even break half their budget.
Yeah. And from what I've heard, for those who like rom-coms, it was fine. It had its moments, and I'm sitting there going, why did nobody from the sports end of entertainment say, you can't be throwing money around like this? It ends up causing problems, because there have been so many stories in the sports world of albatross contracts, of ridiculously overpaying players who certainly are talented, don't get me wrong, but talented enough to warrant that level of contract, that means less money to get other people to support them.
Yeah.
There's a repeat case of a team spending gobs of money for some star player, but because of the fact that they bet the bank on that one guy, they've got nothing to support them in a team sport.
Yeah.
In football, there's the infamous Herschel Walker trade, where the Vikings ended up trading a bunch of draft capital to get one guy who was certainly talented, but it meant they had nothing to support him.
I think that the primary message that can be derived from all this is, if you put so much money in, you have to consider that you are making an investment that has to be paid back.
Yeah.
And if you put, if you put people who don't know how to manage the money and you get them to make the expectations of how much money you're gonna make, they're not gonna know. They're gonna sink in 100, expect 2,000, and when it doesn't make it, they're going to cut the whole thing. In the entertainment industry, this is becoming worryingly common.
I feel, yeah, and I do think, I know that a lot of people have been hoping with one hand, if you catch my drift, that we're going to see a video game crash like we saw all the way back in the 80s. That is not going to happen. That crash back in the 80s was a perfect storm of circumstances. What I do think you will see, on the other hand, is a crunch when it comes to the top end. You let like a lot because, and that's why you're seeing a lot of the top ends just lose a lot of talent, just because they ended up misreading the room during the pandemic and ended up paying way more than they could, or just overconfidence in certain ideas because nobody said you guys are spending way too much. I don't know. Maybe they fired all their accountants or something.
Yeah.
And when it comes to GTA 6, I've seen some people make the argument of, in fact, that 188XQC tried to make the argument of, you spend $100 on skins and you can't pay $100 for a game.
I don't think that's a universal statistic.
Yeah, and when it comes to the people who spend a lot of money on skins for in, say, hero shooters or gacha games or the like, that is a completely separate concern, and two wrongs do not make a right. The whale problem is a problem that's been around for years, and some games very much take advantage of it. I'm not apologizing for it. I am just noting it.
Yeah. I think that, like, using microtransactions to justify the exorbitant cost of a base game is a bass-backwards decision. It's a bass-backwards reasoning.
Yeah.
It's using the problem to reinforce to justify something else that just doesn't work.
Hmm.
And ultimately, I think that a big thing is, have we seen any gameplay of GTA 6?
No.
Outside of those leaks that happened a couple years back? That is worrying.
So it is very much a case of if they don't hit it out of the park, then it's going to be worse than doing nothing.
Yeah. And if it flops, this...
Yeah. I think, especially since given how little Rockstar does with anything else, that is what they're banking on, and going all in like a poker game is generally seen as a bad idea unless you are really, 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 really confident in your hand. And really confident that nobody else has a better hand.
The people who go all in are either the people who actually know what they're doing and have something good, or the people who think that they know what they're doing and take an extreme move to look like they know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But to be fair, like, Red Dead Redemption 2 was something that I think not a lot of people were expecting, took a long time to come out, but it did pay off. So there's the other side of the scale there.
That reminds me of the BioWare magic trap that BioWare fell under.
Elaborate. I'm unfamiliar.
Of thinking that things are a chaotic mess, but it'll all work out because of the quote-unquote BioWare magic. That was part of that expose after Anthem flopped. The problem with that is you can only pull that card so often before all the problems you haven't addressed up to that point come to bite.
Yeah.
And well, they did. Oh, well, they eventually did. They did bite, and they've continued to bite because a friend of mine sent me a copy of Dragon Age: The Veilguard. I think because he wanted to try and fuck with me.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Um, I only if I was to give my impression of the Veilguard, it would be in 2 words: cargo cult. Like how a cargo cult tries to imitate a runway to try and get the planes to come back. It felt like an imitation of what came before, to say, see, we haven't lost our touch. Except in all other aspects, they clearly did, and it was the appearance of competence.
Yeah. Making something that'll look good in the marketing, but doesn't have the same substance that people expected.
I don't even know if it even looked good in the marketing.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Fucking people had the suspicions as soon as the trailer came out, because it looked more like a Guardians of the Galaxy trailer, which...
I had my suspicions long before that, when I was getting reports of all the churn going on.
Yeah.
Like, there are some red flags with the project, and 2 of the big ones is reshoot/rewrites or massive staff changes.
Yeah. You know what suffered both of those, like, heavily?
What?
The Minecraft movie. I did a whole deep dive about this. At one point, they had Rob McElhenney, might be missaying his name, but one of the main creators of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia set to direct the thing. It's wild how they went through like 4 different directors, several different producers. At one point, they had the guy who made Napoleon Dynamite on staff, and it just kept cycling through. And reading all of that and then looking at the current trailer we got, it's interesting to see how little the history of something can impact its end product, especially in entertainment.
Sometimes the behind-the-scenes part is far more fascinating than the final product, but with all of those, with all that churn, it's going to be in the red. I can guarantee you that, because more people means they're bringing up. Those people want to bring in people that they're familiar with, and the cycle repeats. So more hirings and let goes, and more rewrites and more reshoots, which all of those are going to run up the cost. I don't know what the stated budget is for that Minecraft movie, but I guarantee what they actually spent is probably 0.5 to twice the amount of what they actually spent.
Yeah. As of November 1st, 2024, from MoviePhone, 150 million.
They probably with the amount of churn, they probably spent closer to 250 million.
Oh yeah, no. Especially because it's been on and off active development, background development for over a decade.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, one of the surprising things was Dave Bautista signed on like several years ago, and he's been sticking around even with a lot of the churn, which is strange. But
then again, Dave has been going out of his way to try and make the whole transition to Hollywood to acting actually work, and
yeah,
I would say he's done a better job at that transition than other wrestlers turned actors. Not that that's saying much.
Sorry, I'm completely wrong. It wasn't Dave Bautista. It was Jason Momoa. My apologies. Well, yeah, no, I spread misinformation right there.
All right, my bad. Though in that regard, I will say, Momoa needs to fire his agent, because he was considered for the Crow remake at one point before he backed out.
God. Yeah, no.
But
apparently he's been on since 2022.
Yeah. And the Crow remake, I will note, that thing was in development hell for 19 years.
Holy shit.
19 years of just a bunch of... At some point, I feel like there should be a threshold where if you have a certain amount of staff changes, you should just cancel a project.
Oh, yeah,
you're
absolutely.
not gonna get a return on the investment, but you're going to be saving yourself from losing more money.
Yeah. I think that's kind of what the tax cut strategy should be used on, rather than things that are ready to be released already. Like, for example, that Batwoman movie, the Wile E. Coyote film that they had that nobody knew about, that they just cut
The
at
Wile E.
max.
Coyote thing, I think, would have had legs. From what I saw of the Batman project, the Batwoman project, actually, it wasn't
Yeah.
Batwoman, it was Batgirl. That one, I think if that actually did release, it would have flopped.
Yeah, it wasn't screening well. Coyote, they screened it. It had legs, but then they just cut it anyways.
Yeah. And
a lot of shit got cut in that Max merger.
most AT&T did not manage Warner Brothers very well. And because of the merger, part of the collateral for that merger was all the debt.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reason why you saw those aggressive kind of tax cut moves, was to try and clear off that debt.
Yeah.
But I realize we end up going all over the place with this kind of thing, but
it's fine. This is how conversations with me usually go.
Yeah.
It's alright.
I do want to thank you for being open to come all the way to my temple, even with the differences in knowledge, and just sit down and have a few pints and talk about anything and everything, both in and out of RPGs.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure to be here. I almost feel bad for not being able to contribute more, but being able to hear from someone with far more experience in the field has been a very good.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a good experience.
I've often told people, don't underestimate the value of an outside perspective. And if we don't have these kind of conversations, how do we learn?
Absolutely. I appreciate you inviting me on here and bringing me to your monastery.
Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure this will be happening again at some point. But with that said, of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there'll be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.
Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ